Shockingly, there is literature from the 1980s that shows that there are vitamin D receptors in the sleep switches that actually perform these particular duties for us every night. Well, if there are D receptors there, it has to mean that D plays a role in how we sleep, which is D for duh. D runs hibernation. Physicians are still giving prescriptions of D2, which is really a bad idea because the D2 blocks any D3 that person could have. So in someone who's deficient, it makes them more deficient. We must get into these deeper phases of sleep called slow wave sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. If we do not, we feel unrested, have troubles with our memory, we have trouble with our mood, we get various pain syndromes. So sleep is not as simple as I close my eyes, I become unconscious, and then I wake up. There are certain things that have to be done or you start to feel crummy. The most important part is you have to decide at the beginning of your journey, what are the symptoms that are related to this? And it turns out every symptom you have is related to this. Normal humans don't go to the doctor because there's nothing wrong with them. They don't have any complaints.
Stasha, in our world, there's a lot of talk about the benefits of vitamin D, not so much in connection to sleep. So let's start there.
This is a fabulous topic. Unfortunately, I'm just very, very interested in this, and my husband has to drag me away when we're at parties and everything because I want to talk to everybody about it. The unusual experience for me was I was very, very focused on sleep. I started to be interested in sleep. I'm a neurologist. I was not trained specifically in sleep, but I had a general neurology practice in the early 2000s. And one of my patients, who happened to be a young, healthy female with headaches, asked me to do a sleep study on her. And at the time, there was no reason to do that. She didn't complain that her sleep was bad. She says, my husband says I snore. But her reason for wanting a sleep study was because she had terrible headaches. And I had about half of my practice in daily headache sufferers who are generally young, healthy females. She had a sleep study that showed moderate sleep apnea. And that by itself is not too surprising now because we're 20 years later, and now we've learned that you don't have to be an obese middle-aged male to have sleep apnea. But when she put on the CPAP mask, after about 3 to 4 weeks, her headaches went away, which was really weird. At the time, there were no connections in the journals between sleep and headache. There was no reference at the time to sleep apnea in young, healthy females. So that was an unexpected finding. And also, I'd been doing neurology for headache patients for 20 years prior to that. And I knew that it was very dissatisfying for both the patient and myself. We would try these various medicines. Our idea of what causes daily headache now is still pretty poor. And we had pretty crappy outcomes. And so this was one other possible thing that might help my headache patients. With that in mind, I started to do sleep studies. And from 2004 to 2009, I literally did thousands of sleep studies, first on my young, healthy females with headache, but then on anybody who would let me, because all of the young, healthy females had abnormal sleep studies. It wasn't obvious at first because they did not have apnea. So apnea means stop breathing. The first patient had apnea. We're probably not going to want to spend a lot of time talking about apnea, but they're the thing that controls our ability to be asleep, unconscious, and paralyzed, and to still keep breathing is the brain stem, this little piece at the bottom of the brain that connects the brain to the spinal cord. That means that there is a place that is a neurology issue. It's in the brain that controls our ability to keep breathing and not to relax our throat too much and stop breathing. So this is really a neurology problem that has been historically dealt with by the pulmonologists who have the little machines that blow up air. So one, I really think that sleep apnea should have been a neurology issue. And it turns out that what we're going to talk about most of this hour is that brainstem not only has to do with how we breathe through this tube that's paralyzed, but also what is it that's allowing us to get into these deeper phases of sleep? The patient whose headache went away, something happened in her sleep. And since I'm very chemically oriented, you'll see as I just love biochemistry, I thought, well, gee, if she's just staying in deep sleep longer, she must be making some chemical that's making her head pain switch go into the off position, which is where it's supposed to be. So I'm thinking, okay, well, this machine, the CPAP machine, is allowing her to stay in a particular phase of sleep longer. And then I'm doing these sleep studies. And as I'm looking at the sleep studies, what wasn't obvious to me at first had to be pointed out by the pulmonologist was, my pulmonologist said, I don't know if you've noticed this, but the patients you're sending me are young, healthy females, and they really have a different pattern on these sleep studies. Most of them don't have any rapid eye movement sleep, which is one of the phases of deep sleep, or they have REM-related apnea, or their REM sleep is delayed. So I was aware that there are deep phases of sleep and lighter phases, but I wasn't actually looking at what was reported as what was happening. I was looking at the report. The report said no significant apnea. So for about 2 years, I was like, what is different about these women who have apnea, and I can put them on the CPAP, and the ones that don't have apnea, they both have the same complaints. And what was happening is the real stuff, the meat of the report, was there, but they weren't putting it on the front page. So the most important part of what happens during our sleep is that we must get into these deeper phases of sleep called slow wave sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. If we do not get into those two phases and spend enough time in there, we feel unrested. We can have troubles with our memory. We have trouble with our mood. We get various pain syndromes. So sleep is not as simple as I close my eyes, I become unconscious, and then I wake up. There are certain things that have to be done or you start to feel crummy. Any questions about that, or should I keep?
No, keep going. But I want to make sure as part of this opening, we talk about what an ideal sleep looks like in the different phases.
Exactly. Okay, so let's get to that. So when I'm looking at this, that there's not enough REM sleep, the first question is, well, why? And why isn't it on the report? And I always put this in there because there are many people who've had sleep studies already. They suspect that they don't sleep well, even though they're asleep for 8 hours, and then they're told that their sleep study is normal. Many of the sleep studies do not report the full amount of deep sleep that was recorded, the amount of rapid eye movement sleep that was recorded. And every person who spends enough time, like their whole night in the supervised sleep study, needs to have that information. Now, in the meantime, we have all these sleep trackers that will tell us this. And the sleep trackers really follow how long are we paralyzed. So what you can easily follow by something that's kind of like a gyroscope called actigraphy that's in your Apple Watch or in your Oura Ring is when you're moving and when you're not. And when you're in deep sleep, you're paralyzed. That means you can actually put on a ring and say, I spent 2 hours paralyzed in the beginning of the night, 2 hours paralyzed at the end of the night. Normal sleep, which is slightly complex at the moment, but let's go back to the 1960s when the very first studies were done. The first studies were done in the late 60s, early 70s at Stanford. The very first sleep lab was from 1972. I was graduating high school then. That means I could have been one of the first Stanford medical students to be measured, which is, when you think about it, compared to how old medicine is in a general sense, we left sleep for last. And that's kind of pitiful. But it's because we're humans and we just are unconscious during sleep. So we just don't think about it. But as I became more and more infatuated with the idea that if every single person in my neurology practice has a sleep disorder, then why am I not treating that sleep disorder at the same time as whatever specific disease they have? Because if most of these diseases are genetic, then they had that genetic tendency. Epilepsy, headache, tremor. I should be treating both of those. I'm giving these little medicines that modify it, but I should be treating both. That means I start to ask all these questions about sleep. And all that humans have when we started was, how long do I sleep? How do I feel when I wake up? How many times do I wake? As soon as I have these sleep studies and I can see that, wow, this sleep study shows that this poor 18-year-old, this is what actually happened. This poor 18-year-old has no deep sleep. The normals from the 60s, 1972, the normals generated were young, healthy medical students and college students. They would have 8 hours of sleep, 4 hours of it would be deep sleep, meaning that the patterns of the electrical waves from the brain would be different. The first 2 hours would be slow wave sleep because the patterns would be slow and regular. And the other 2 hours were rapid eye movement sleep, where the eyes would be moving back and forth. Nobody knew what those were about. But what I then saw in my patients was, oh, they're sleeping for 8 hours. They wake up at 3 a.m. They go back to sleep, but they never get into rapid eye movement sleep. There was this consistent lack of rapid eye movement sleep in otherwise normal, healthy people. Because that is a neurology problem, it's not due to the airway. It's not something I can give them CPAP for. The first question would be, well, why is that happening? And in fact, that's why they don't put it on the report. Because as soon as it's on the report, then I would say, hey, Jesse, you don't have any rapid eye movement sleep. And you'd be like, well, that's at least encouraging. I know there's something wrong with me and I know I feel tired. And then you say, okay, fix me. What are we going to do? And I say, I don't know. I don't have a clue. Nobody has a clue. Until we actually observe that there's a consistent absence of this deep phase, then we have a hard time even knowing that that's going on. Then the next weird part about this is, how do we study these things? Like what we're really doing in the science side is we're now taking a bunch of other Stanford medical students and college students, and we're doing sleep studies in them. The sleep studies that have been done in the last 10 years at Stanford Sleep Study Center, when you compare them to the early 70s, show these are the recent results. These are the modern normals, that teenagers and kids in their early 20s have an uptick in the amount of brain activity between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. So they don't even go to sleep until 1 a.m. That means our response to that is to start high school later. What they don't know that we're going to talk about is those kids are all vitamin D deficient. They actually have a sleep disorder. If you compare them to the people that were in my high school class who were being recorded at that time, they went to sleep at 9:30 and they didn't have any trouble falling asleep. But because they're not looking at it from a historical standpoint, instead, so when you say, what's normal? The problem is that the current normal is my kid wakes up 5 times a night. Like if you look at little kids, the sleep recordings on little kids now, or just the sleep behavior, it's horrible. So things have changed dramatically over the last 40 years. Therefore, it's a little deeper than just what's normal sleep. The next question would be, if I have normal sleep according to looking at my relatives and my mother and my grandmother and my aunt and everybody else that I know, but I feel terrible, should I just stop there and say, oh, my sleep is normal? That's a little tough because all we really know is what our family sleep is. And then now they're going to watch you, Jesse, and you're going to tell them what's normal. What's normal is you get up in the morning and you're raring to go and you don't have a single pain anywhere. You're not depressed. You're not anxious. You have enough concentration and enough brain power to go through your whole day, whatever it is you're doing. And you get calmed down easily without even meditating by 9 o'clock. And at 9:30, you go to bed and you fall asleep at 10. That is so uncommon. And the people who feel that and do that, they don't spend time on the internet looking at health broadcasts. They feel fine and they do everything. So they don't find it's not interesting to them. And that's the odd thing about medicine is directed towards whatever walks in the door that's not functioning correctly. We don't focus on what's peak performance per se. Okay, that was not the way we were designed. So at the end of 5 years of doing all these sleep studies, noticing this particular very important lack of rapid eye movement sleep, spending a lot of time thinking about why would there be this big change? Because I know that when I was 20 years old, I didn't have pain when I woke up. Nobody I knew was on an antidepressant. We didn't have trouble sleeping. I know that there's been a big shift in this for years. And there was an 18-year-old gal who actually did a sleep study for me in 2009. So I've been doing this now for 5 years, and she had no deep sleep at all. She was a perfectly normal, beautiful girl about to go to college. She had daily headache, and her sleep study, when you asked her, how's your sleep? She said, my sleep is fine. She would sleep for 12 hours easily, but she felt so tired. So that question, how's your sleep, has actually a lot more depth to it than that. I see a sleep study that looks horrible. She's waking to light sleep 35 times an hour. She's not awake. She doesn't know this is happening. She's waking so that any time that her brain tries to get into this deeper healing phase of sleep, it's prevented. It's not because she's stopping breathing. So I have no answer for her. I can't give her a sleeping pill. She's asleep already for 12 hours. Okay. That means I'm now put into a totally different mindset. Like something's badly wrong with this part of the brain stem that's running her sleep. But I don't have a clue what to do for her. And it wouldn't make any sense to her to give her a sleeping pill, which is really my only options. I had CPAP and sleeping pills. That was it. At that point, she said, I'm so tired. Is there anything you can do? And out of desperation, I did a B12 level and a thyroid test. And her B12 level turned out to be profoundly low. Because I was so desperate and because I had nothing else to offer to her, I thought, wow, wait, let me think about this differently. Maybe these little cells. And so in the meantime, I'm reading these articles about the anatomy of the brainstem. What are the cells that actually do this for us, that get us paralyzed? I mean, paralysis during sleep, that's frightening. And I'm reading these really wacky articles about single cell recordings from pacemaker cells in the brainstem that are firing at a certain rate. And they have to fire at this certain rate since the day you're born, actually way before that, till the day you die. And that's how things happen in the electrical system in our body. They have to have a certain firing rate. And I think, well, maybe those cells are B12 deficient. Like, I don't even know what B12 does at this point. I was very interested in vitamins before medical school, but I was kind of brainwashed out of them after. But I thought, what if this is a deficiency state? What if the brain could do its work, but it doesn't have what it needs? So I start to give B12 injections. I'm sending them back to their internists for this. It turns out that in the meantime, since I was in training, internists don't get paid for giving B12 shots anymore. Instead, they give them the bottle of the B12 and the syringes. So my patients are giving themselves shots, and they all say the same thing. I'm giving my shots once a week because I get 2 good nights and then 4 or 5 bad ones. And I was like, wait, you're supposed to do it once a month. Well, the first thing that's important there is they actually had a noticeable change in their sleep. It turns out B12 has got a bunch of articles, at least 30 years of articles about B12 and sleep and feeling refreshed and activated. Most people who are B12 deficient, you give them a shot, they go, wow, it gives me energy. Okay. We're focusing on still, how do I feel during the day? But I feel energy is really usually paired with, and I sleep better. But there's something wrong with the way that we've been doing B12. So the shots are really not the way it should be given. It should be given every day. Every day is a pill. And then the second thing that happened within a few weeks was one of my patients said, my doctor told me I was vitamin D deficient. She gave me vitamin D and my wrist pain went away. And she didn't say anything about her sleep. She had a lot of problems with pain and all other complaints. And at the time, I didn't know enough to actually ask about those other complaints. But I said, I'm doing blood levels anyway, which was brand new. I would never do blood levels on my patients for anything. So I'm doing B12 and I just throw in the D. And it turns out everybody was D deficient. Because I had never really thought of this as a deficiency state before, I had never really been interested in vitamins. It was a really big step to go into doing blood levels on people. And unfortunately, these blood levels are extremely complex and they have really limited utility. But what happened very quickly was between August of 2009 and December of 2009, I was drawing Ds and B12s on everybody who had had a sleep study with me, who had complaints of some kind, either that they weren't any better, their headaches weren't any better, they still had body pain, and everybody's D was low. And that was in the setting of, if we make D during the summer, they should be okay. It's August. So the next thing that happened was in December of that year, 2 guys who were on CPAP for their daily headaches come in and say, you told me that this CPAP would help me have no headaches, and it didn't work. And I've been using it for a year. But that last time I was in here, you told me to get a D level, and then you sent me that little lab slip about taking D. So I went out and bought it, and about 3 weeks later, I start to realize I'm sleeping better, and my headache's gone. 2 guys tell me that within 1 week. And since I'm now pretty desperate, and I'm looking for an answer, and the D's are all low, I go and look at the literature. And shockingly, there is literature from the 1980s, which is now 40 years ago, that shows that there are vitamin D receptors in the sleep switches that actually perform these particular duties for us every night. Well, if there are D receptors there, it has to mean that D plays a role in how we sleep, which is D for duh. D runs hibernation. So all you have to do is happen to, by accident. So I accidentally got into the literature written by a guy named Walter Stumpf, who had a very clear picture in his mind for what this hormone was about, because it is not a vitamin. Calling it a vitamin has really ruined medicine's view of this chemical, and it has really made the entire public of the globe suffer needlessly. So it's not a vitamin. It doesn't come from outside. It's not in the food. Yes, it's true that if you eat salmon, you might get some of that salmon's vitamin D, but you might also get some of the estrogen from that salmon if it's a female salmon. But that's salmon's estrogen. It's not your estrogen. You can't. So this is a hormone. That means we make it from being outdoors. And if you look a little bit more deeply into the literature, 100 years ago, there are people writing about the fact that rickets, which was a disease of infants and toddlers that was rather non-specific. It was kids who wouldn't walk, wouldn't play, cried all the time, wouldn't sleep. They were just terribly cranky. They were showing that if you put them outdoors and put them in the sun for a few minutes every day, that rickets would go away. And this is way before anybody shows an X-ray of their legs, because the X-ray machine was just starting to be used. Those articles already are talking about civilization has made us move indoors. And as we move indoors, we are no longer living the biologic life that we were meant to live. 100 years ago, there are these really amazing realizations by the doctors treating these patients. Now, in the meantime, because it was called a vitamin and a nutrient, and it's coming from food, and because medicine gets its head stuck in whatever its thinking is, it is so slow to move. It's labeled as a nutrient, it's labeled as a vitamin, we're going to keep it in that area. And so then they look for what's the vitamin, quote unquote, because I'm determined this is going to be a vitamin, that could come out of the food. And they do the studies looking for the chemical itself to treat rickets. They do the studies in rats. And rats are nocturnal animals. That's a special kind of mammal. That mammal doesn't need to be out in the sun to thrive. That means that mammal actually has a vitamin D receptor that can use a vitamin D that is much, much older than the ones that we make on our skin that come from fungus. So fungus, mushrooms. So it turns out that rats can eat moldy bread and get the vitamin D that they need to be healthy and reproduce from vitamin D2. So the first thing that was found was vitamin D2. And it really was in the food, but it was in the yeast that was growing, or the mold is growing on the food. And it's now, that was in the 1940s, which means that it's now 80 years later. These studies are really clear, and they're in the literature, and there is a minority opinion that has been squawking about this for 80 years, saying, one, D2 is not what all animals make on this planet. In fact, starting with flowering plants, D3, which is a different chemical, came out. Despite all those articles, D2 is still occasionally being put into things. Physicians are still giving prescriptions of D2, which is really a bad idea because the D2 blocks any D3 that person could have. So in someone who's deficient, it makes them more deficient. Even in the last, especially since COVID, when there are like picturing it as like two background choruses. There's the doctors that actually were in the ICU with the patients dying, who think that they're about to lose this patient, who give D3 and like 40,000 IUs, and the patient wakes up the next day and their lungs look totally different. And those doctors are like, damn, this is amazing. And they start to turn out articles about how treatment in the ICU is turning around COVID. And we can talk about why that is and why it's so dramatic. But the second chorus is, oh, that's a vitamin that shouldn't even be something that we arrogant, smarter, more informed physicians should be talking about, because we've delegated the word vitamin to lesser humans like nutrition and dietitians. We don't state that, but it's implied. That is really weird, because all of these things that we artificially named vitamins are at the center of every biochemical pathway that we learn about in medical school. We can't just forget about those pathways. They're there. And just because we arbitrarily said one's a vitamin and, oh, this is a drug company, new chemical. So we've changed medicine dramatically, even in the 30 years that I've been practicing, to be so focused on pharmaceuticals. But what do all of us, including me, when I get sick, I don't want to take these medicines I'm giving out like candy. I just want to get better. I don't want to have to take them. None of us want to take them. So in actual fact, we'd rather see a way to get back to our normal self. The key to my looking at all of this and seeing miraculous things happening in mundane settings is that sleep is how we heal. It's not that vitamins are the only answer. Sleep hygiene is important. Whether or not you go outside is important. Your exercise and your diet, they're all important. They will all play a role. But if you do everything that your doctor recommends and that you, Jesse, recommend, and you still live indoors, you will not actually heal, because you cannot really heal in sleep while you live indoors. And that piece has been ignored. Clearly, in the last 4 years or since COVID, when we all moved really indoors, there has been such a dramatic worsening in mood and physical feelings that we're now starting to see movements about schools should be led under the trees. You know, there are people going to extremes, but frankly, our biology occurred living outdoors.
You mentioned D2. That is not good, actually detrimental. So we want to avoid that. You also touched on D in food. It sounded like not important. I'm not sure if there's detriment there.
It's not detriment.
Talk about that piece before we move forward. The D in food, and then does that play a role in the benefits we're talking about, or is that not enough to really count?
Because we call this a nutrient, everybody who writes about it says these are the right foods to get it from. And they always mention salmon. And in actual fact, when we make D on our skin from being in the sun from a particular wavelength, so it happens that wavelength is only there during certain fixed hours. If you live at the equator, you can get UVB light from probably around 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And then at the equator, it never changes. It's still available during those because of the angle of the sun. So as it's coming up, but it's a different angle and that wavelength is blocked. If we move towards, let's say, Texas, where I am, there are only certain months of the year where that UVB light will be available for me to make. Let's just assume that all of us live outdoors. That means that during the winter, I would change things. Well, this chemical was perfectly adapted to our planet when the dinosaurs were successful. This chemical was old at the time that the dinosaurs were here. That means it was already modifying the behavior and the mechanisms within the body. So for instance, if I move to the far north or south on our planet where it's snow covered and there's no food available for 4 months of the year, I either hibernate or I migrate. And I migrate to the equator. So the birds from northern Canada are migrating now towards the equator because they can actually use the UVB light at the equator, continue their energy metabolism. So these are all things we've all observed, and we go, wow, isn't that amazing? They all fly to the equator. But why would they do that? Because it allowed for, one, they would have food sources that wouldn't be, so you have either two possibilities. You either migrate or you hibernate. Well, if I hibernate, it means I go into a hole and I sleep and I lower my general metabolism of the body. And we know that pretty specifically in bears. And we know that bears can actually go without eating for 4 or 5 months. We know that a lot of sea animals like whales may actually be nursing their young and not eating for 4 months. Then there are all these other things that come up and say, well, wait, if that bear has to be feeding her cubs for those 4 months, how does she give those cubs their vitamins if the vitamins come from the food and she's not eating? So there are little questions like that crop up. So in the background, one, D3 is the chemical that appeared on this planet from flowering plants. So it appears that historically D3, slightly different, really showed up when there were two sexes. So yeast, fungus do not reproduce sexually. They don't have two sexual forms, male and female. Everything that came after, including flowering plants, and the great majority of the animals on this planet, insects, birds, fish, everybody, has two sexes. One of the important things that should happen when you live at the far north or south is you should put your reproduction into a place where your young can be born when there's food. If you have your cubs and you don't have milk for them, if you birth your cubs in June, then you have to keep those cubs in a hole, which, manage your 2 and 3 year olds at home, keep them in a hole for 4 months. It's not going to happen. So there are these specific little things that were done in each animal. And keep in mind that I don't believe there's a puppet master doing this. I believe that there are successful animals that are still on the planet, and they were helped in being able to become dormant in the winter, go through a span of time when there was very little food, and then come out in the spring and become active and growth producing. And D at its core is about that. It's when it's low, you become dormant. You don't repair your tissues. And actually, we see a lot of people walking around who are 100 or 200 pounds overweight that have stayed in a winter mode and have gained a huge amount of weight because their D is so low. This stuff is in the literature since the 80s, but it was not interpreted by medicine because we've been looking through the wrong lens, more or less. It's not that taking in salmon estrogen D3 from the salmon is wrong. It's that we've just proved over the last 40 years that getting your D from food sources is not enough because we all have low Ds enough to not be able to sleep, not be able to be healthy, not to be in a good mood. It's very difficult to say, oh, all these diseases that we've seen increasing and moving into younger populations over the last 40 years are due to X. Everybody has an explanation, okay? We eat non-real foods, they're too processed, we don't exercise enough. Those are all true. But if you address all of those in your life, and then you're sitting across the room from me, and I'm your neurologist, and you say, I've been doing paleo, I've done this, I've done that, I walk outside every day, you've done everything your doctor says, but I still don't sleep, and I still have hypertension and diabetes and blah, 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 then I'm left with, could there be something else? And it was that setting where I said, it looks to me like everybody's got abnormal sleep. Why would they? And then I stumble into this vitamin D, and D is playing a role in sleep. And then the next really important discovery is, one, in order to get your D into a range where your sleep is better, your D has to go to a certain place within the D level, the D blood level. So this guy, Walter Stump, and I published an article in 2012 that, based on his scientific evidence of vitamin D receptors and my clinical experience with my patients, if you get the D over 60 and you keep it in the 60s in a range between 60 and 80, that's when everybody in my practice started saying, you know what, my sleep is better. And that has continued to be very consistent since then, which was 2012. So it's now 10 years. And that by itself was enough to get us better. Unfortunately, the second part of the story is D by itself makes us better, but it wasn't the full story. And that's when the second part comes along, which is the microbiome.
All right, we're going to get there, but I want to talk more about this range of 60 to 80 being the ideal. Tying back to the hibernation migration piece of animals, would you say it's normal throughout the year to have different periods where vitamin D levels are elevated and then dip? Somebody like me in Ontario who is here all year round, and naturally in the wintertime, I'm not going to be getting as much sun, my vitamin D is going to come down. Could it be argued that that is normal to have those peaks and valleys throughout, say, a full year?
It is completely normal for the D to move around. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to make these alterations in our habits. So seasonality of reproduction would not exist, and being able to gain weight for the winter to get you through the winter would not exist. So the D should move up and down. So we mentioned the fact that we have normals from hunter-gatherers who live outside. That's a slightly different question than what should I as a neurologist do with someone who has a sleep disorder when we're living in a time when not sleeping normally is now the new normal. So we're asking a slightly different question. We're saying, can I take this chemical that has a natural role in sleep that would go lower in the winter, which would mean we would sleep longer, and it would go higher in the summer, and we would sleep less time and spend more time outside, and we would be more matched to what was happening to the seasonality where we lived, okay? So we're taking that normal fluctuation of things, and instead of observing the normal, we're asking a question, which is, can I take what I know about this scientifically and use it to improve my patient's health? And that's a really different question, okay? So the first question most people have is there a normal level of D? What's the normal D level? And the next question is there an ideal D level? Because what we all want when we're interested and we're going to the internet for biohacking is, well, I don't want to be normal. I want to be better than normal, okay? The question I had was a very simple one. If the D level is low in all of my patients and they have a specific rapid eye movement sleep deficiency state, and I can show that there are D receptors in this part of the brain that runs that system, is there a D level where my patient would say, I'm sleeping better? And in actual fact, it was not easy. It was not hard to show that. I'm not a scientist. I'm a clinician. So all I did was ask my patients, how's your sleep now? And they'd say, terrible. And I'd go, oh, bummer. Are you taking that D? And I'd say, yeah. And I'd send them down, and their D was still 45. And when it started to cross over 60, it was very consistent. Now, what you learn quickly once you get into the biohacking world is that everything is attached to everything else. So even though we can talk about an ideal level, a normal level, etc., I don't want to give anybody the idea that I am a D expert. I'm not, because there isn't one on this planet. It is incredibly complex. So anytime you want to step into biohacking and take vitamin D as a supplement, and it's not the same as walking outside and standing in the sun, you have done something that has manipulated your biology, and you've actually done something that's taken that D and put it in your body at a time when you were not receiving the other energy wavelengths that came with being out in the sun. So the actual story is you want to get closer to what those hunter-gatherers are doing. But there are a few things about if I want to get better enough so that I can actually go back to living outdoors, or the actual practicality of my life just is not going to allow me to live outdoors all the time. How can I hack this in a way that it's safe, quote unquote, that it won't cause difficulties? So your first question, does it go up and down? Absolutely. Does it still go up and down? Am I people who are taking supplements? Absolutely. But the odd thing is, 90% of them can say, my XYZ just came back. For me, I get visual aura migraine. If my D drops into the high 50s, it's to 58, I start to have this flickering thing of migraine. It has to be there for a while before that happens. But I'll go into the lab and say, I think my D's low, and it's only 58. So there's a difference between 62 and 58 that's been consistent for 10 years in me. And it's not just me. It's different. The symptom complex that comes when the D is too high or too low is unique for each person. There are groupings of that. But it still means that there is a specific blood level in the brain, and we aren't measuring the blood level in the brain. That's really important. But there's a specific blood level, and the only thing that we have to measure in all of my, what I'm calling the RightSleep program, is the vitamin D level. There are also some really big complications with the kind of vitamin D levels that are being done now, which is another complicated issue. I don't know if you want to go into that or...
We will, but I want to get into what you just said first. You mentioned the fact that somebody working with you would still have fluctuations throughout the year. Is that just based on the fact that depending on where they're living, the difference in the amount of sun they're going to get throughout the year, plus whatever supplementation they're doing besides that?
Yes. So unfortunately, this is very complex. The first question would be to get, well, Stasha, what dose of D should I take to get to a D level of 60? Every single person that I dealt with, at the beginning, I was completely a novice. If I knew how complicated this was, I never would have gone down this road. I had a website called the Vitamin D Council that was started by a guy named John Cannell, who's a psychiatrist at the time. And in the early 2000s, he was the first person who finagled a way for lay people to get their D levels. So unfortunately, it turns out that we have this connection between here's a dose and here's a blood level. That's the way vitamins are taught right now. That's utter bullshit. It is not true. You cannot measure a blood level of a vitamin that is being active in a cell in the brain, and think that the blood level reflects what's going on in that brain cell. It's not the same compartment. And you're not, even if you take cerebrospinal fluid, you're not measuring what's actually happening in the cell. It's not that I'm the only person talking about that. It's that we're never going to really get around that problem. And even people who measure levels of things in the white blood cells when you draw blood, that's a white blood cell. It's not the same as your brain cell. It's not the same as your brain stem. So it turns out that you as a human being can tell me a lot about what your D levels are or what your B5 level may be by what's happening to you. You can tell me those things and I can attach those symptoms. And then you can take that thing and make it go away or come back in a way that's much more dependable than the blood level. So the first issue is these blood levels. The second issue is the blood level doesn't tell you how long that person has been deficient. So I've got, let's say, 800 patients, 1,000 patients, and I'm giving them D dosing, and I have a very difficult time knowing what the dosing should be. The FDA says 1,000 IUs. So I start giving 1,000 IUs, and those first two guys who came in and said, my sleep got better when you told me about vitamin D, all the women who came in January, after I came back and read all the literature, their Ds were lower. Like they had been 22 when I measured them in August. They're taking 1,000 IUs and their level's 18. So then I'm like, well, how much should I give? I have no idea. So over struggling for a whole year and then into 2 years to figure out what's the right dose. Well, every single person needed a different dose. Some people needed 2,000, other needed 50,000 a day. That is this completely explodes all the instructions that people give on the internet. Just take 5,000. Just take 100,000 on a piece of bread once a month. That's all made up. Everything I'm saying is a made up explanation, but it is an observation of 1,000 people and what happened to them. So, and then I make up explanations for it. So the second piece is the dose that you need to go from a level of 20 to a level of 60 in the blood is dependent on how profound your D deficiency is and how long it's been that way. A 20-year-old who was a lifeguard until 2 years ago and has always been swimming and always been outside and lives in Los Angeles, who comes in after 2 years of working in the Target warehouse in the summer and for the first time is having daily headaches and comes in to see me in September and has a level of 20, is not going to be the same as his grandmother who has osteoporosis because her D's been low forever, has rheumatoid arthritis, has terrible pain, has a million other things wrong with her. She has been D low at a level of 20 for 40 years. And every cellular system in the body that uses D has had to turn that repair system off as she's been dormant for 40 years. The kid's only been dormant for 2 years. And he may not even have a sleep disorder yet that he's aware of. He may just be coming in with daily headache. So one of the really surprising things is the Endocrine Society, which is a group of endocrinologists. This should be an endocrinology. It is a hormone. We make it. The Endocrine Society put out in 2024 a recommendation after lots of study, and they were really smart. They said, you know what? We don't actually have enough clinical experience with how to dose vitamin D. And the reason why they don't is it's a vitamin. So they're not taking responsibility for it. My observations over a period of 10 years are really valuable clinical observations, but I haven't done it in a scientific way. I don't have it in a database. I can't put it in. And because our journals are not accustomed to taking clinical observations anymore, they won't take my clinical observation as being valid. But the Endocrine Society finally came out and said, we do not have enough clinical experience to know what to tell a clinician once they've done a D level. We don't know what dose to give to approach another D level. So our recommendation is you don't do D levels. That was the recommendation. Okay, they've been asked to do that, and they completely sidestepped the responsibility. And they did also say that all the clinical studies that are giving 4,000 a day to half of the group, they said that's totally worthless. Fixed dose studies in hormones are ridiculous. Hormones are managed by blood levels, thyroid, testosterone, estrogen, always blood levels. That means one of the difficulties is trying to put out, and I have a booklet and I have a website and I have recommendations, but you're still taking a little bit of a chance. You have to start off with X dose. You do your level again in a month and you see what happened to you personally. That is the core of how you use this hormone. What is my body asking for? And that is totally different. As soon as you put that vitamin word on it, we've all been told that there's a daily recommended dose. I can spend 3 hours. I had this happen with a group in Edmonton. I lecture for 3 hours about D. I give them all the history. I give them the whole thing. And at the end, the first question is, there should be a daily recommended dose. And I said, you're absolutely right, because we named it a vitamin, but this doesn't have a daily recommended dose. That puts us in a very difficult spot. Now, if we weren't also desperate, and if I lived in Ontario, I'd be even more desperate. I'm interested in health. I don't want to get these diseases. I'm looking into this before they happen to me. Then the next question would be what you haven't asked, but is a very logical question. Should I be hacking around or playing around with this D if there's nothing wrong with me? If I'm not trying to fix something, is it bad for me to be supplementing? And I would say, yes, it is bad for you to be doing that. You really need to have access to D levels. You have to understand it a little bit better. And unfortunately, if I get into this in a social situation, my first fear is you're going to take D, your D is going to go up. The D is going to tell the body it's time to repair things. You're going to start to make repairs. And the things that are used for those repairs are the vitamins, the real vitamins that we don't make, that are made by our bacteria in the belly. And what I next found out was if I keep somebody's D at 60 and I don't fix their source of these other building blocks, which are not only the B vitamins, but all the minerals, iron, all the other things that we use, the little pieces that come together to make a normal, healthy cell. If I don't fix that, you've actually sent a message to the bodies to try to repair things, and you've depleted other things. So you encourage other deficiency states.
You quickly touched on something there that piqued my interest, and I want to get further into the vitamin D that we're getting from sun exposure versus supplements. And we also talked about food. So there's these three different players that make for a gray area in different ways when it comes to dosing, because different seasons, we're going to have different exposure to different amounts of sunlight. But also, and you touched on this really quickly, is the D we're getting from the sun having a different impact on the body versus supplementing? Because there is likely so much more going on there than science currently understands. And for us to think that we can go in and take a drop of vitamin D each day and get the same benefits seems foolish.
It is foolish. That's well stated. So the other thing that you should know is there's a guy named Andrzej Slominski, and he came from Poland. This guy is brilliant. He's in a dermatology department, which is really weird. He's a primary scientist. He's a biochemist. He started in melanoma, and then oddly enough went to melanin, and then went to D. And melanin is also a hormone. And then he asks questions about D that no one else thought to ask, because he's looking at the physical structure of this chemical and showing what it does in the receptor. It has a three-dimensional structure, and he's thinking about how it fits into the receptor. He now has 10 years worth of articles that show that there are a rainbow of types of Ds. If you just look at vitamin D on the internet, what you'll see is there's vitamin D, the storage form, that's the 25OH. There's the active form, the 125OH. No, there are probably 20 active forms, maybe 25, maybe 30. That means and most of the forms that he's finding on the skin that are formed by UVB light exposure are things that have to do with inflammation, scarring. They're things that were naturally being made to make sure that the UVB light exposure that damages our DNA is being repaired. So you can show that there are articles back from the 90s where you take a squamous cell carcinoma, you grow it in a petri dish, you drop vitamin D on it, it converts to normal skin. Because there were processes already developed on purpose at the same time that were aware of the fact that the UVB light would damage the DNA structure. So there are repair processes that had happened. That means we're giving one form of vitamin D. We're not giving it in the same setting that it's meant to be created, which is on our skin and in this rainbow of things. And there are other chemicals that actually have different names, like lumestrol and other things that are named differently, but are very similar structurally, that are supposed to be there at the same time. Okay. So that means there are multiple hormones being made. But then there's a second issue, and is even deeper than that, which is there's really good literature that shows that infrared light, so other wavelengths, some that we can visually see, but others that aren't visible to us, that are penetrating our body. So that infrared light can penetrate 2 to 3 centimeters or more and has effects on mitochondrial health. And it affects the melatonin, which we've artificially said is a hormone that has to do with sleep. But melatonin turns out to be pivotal to mitochondrial health throughout the body. So there are all these simplifications. So when someone writes a journal article and they talk about an experiment, then they're asked to write a chapter. They tend to try to codify things and make them understandable to a bigger public, and they oversimplify. When the actual answer is, if you have a sleep disorder, what should I do? The first answer is go outside more. There are some things about that we could go into in more depth, but there are lots of people on the internet that are actually talking about their experience as being, can't sleep until 4 a.m. I've slept from 4 a.m. till noon the whole last 10 years. I go out and I have this camping experience where I camp the whole month. of August in Quebec. And I start sleeping, 10 o'clock. So there are multiple things about not only light being perceived through the eye, but multiple wavelengths of energy that are being biologically integrated into our body. So at the end of all of this, one, biohacking has its dangers. Two, I think it's valuable to know about it. And it's within a context of really seeing this as a set of beliefs. And if you really want to say, I'm a normal person and I don't have any diseases yet, what are the things I should do? That's a really different question than this is me. I'm 69 years old and I have restless legs and I have this and this and this. And I'd like to try this biohacking to see if I can get my restless legs to go away so I can come off my medicine. Those are two really different questions, but they're often clumped together as though they're the same. They're not. Your question about Ontario is really important because one of the things we referred to before was that there are lots of studies coming out of Finland with this really, really smart biologist. Now, if you look at who's been living where on the planet, there are lots of people who lived in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and they live to be 90 years old. Well, their vitamin D levels can't be the same as somebody who's living in the equator if they're not actually supplementing. But there are all sorts of other things that they do, habits that they have that are health producing, like cold plunge and going into saunas and other things that are, as far as I can tell, adaptations that have had similar effects or have substituted because their longevity is great. So it's only when we moved into the modern world and we sit at a desk and we don't go out, and since most of the Nordic countries are phenomenal about exercising. Like I have clients who are in Norway, their kids are skiing every day after school in the dark. I mean, the ski slopes are lighted, but everybody, they didn't have a choice. If they wanted to go get something to eat, they had to be on their skis. So they lived outdoors much, much more. That means if you're going to ask, do I have to supplement when I live in Ontario? Well, kinda, because you're not really raising sheep in Ontario anymore. You're not farming in Ontario. You're not a Native American living in Ontario. We were just in Alaska. And if you go into what it would be like to live in Alaska and try to survive as an Indigenous people, you wouldn't be sitting inside. There's no food in there. You would be outside all day long until you were fatigued, and then you would be sleeping in your little whatever. So you might be inside your igloo if there were storms. So it's much more wide-ranging than that. And I think my view of what I'm doing is this is the very first steps in the direction of trying to biohack in a cautious way and to be attentive to what my body tells me while I'm trying to change my habits to fit with what were actually the normal things that all other animals do, which is to live outside more.
For somebody that's going to take this on, biohack, start supplementing with vitamin D. We know we avoid D2, so we're going to supplement with D3. We know we can't just blindly recommend a dosage. It's going to be different depending on the person, and we need to test and see how we're feeling. But when it comes to supplements, there's capsules, there's liquid, different types of vitamin D3. Is there a certain type that you recommend?
I have not seen any difference. And this also gets me into the supplement world, which I had no experience with at the beginning of this. Keep in mind that my population are people who like allopathic medicine, or they wouldn't have been seeing me. And they take 5 different pills because they're seeing a bunch of doctors and now they're seeing a neurologist. So me convincing them to take 4 vitamin D pills plus a B50 plus a multivitamin plus a B12 was not easy. And it had to be cheap and easy. Okay. So because of the population I was working with, I wasn't saying, gee, this is the brand I want you to take. I also don't like the idea that we should be making a 400% markup on something that should be free. Okay. These are people who are sick, and you can go outside and get this for free. How right is it for me to be making a bunch of money on, repackaging this? So one, I don't really have a favorite brand. I really think that you should get whatever it is that you can afford. It shouldn't be expired. I don't think there's much difference between whether it's gel caps or tablets. I think that the most important thing is paying attention to the dose. Like every other chemical you put in your body, the dose is important. And we have been coaxed into this level of ambivalence or lack of interest in what's in the multivitamin to a point of saying, oh, multivitamins won't hurt you and they're good for you. Neither one of those things is true. Multivitamins can have anything in them. You don't ever read the back. And it turns out the dose inside that of especially the B vitamins is pivotal in whether or not you'll sleep or not. So my biggest struggle was not which brand should you buy. And almost everybody says, why don't you just publish your own bottles and just give it to me? No, because the reason why I'm not doing that is you have to learn what the dosage is. You have to connect. I took a vitamin that has 55 milligrams of B5 in it, and I couldn't sleep at all. And I go and I pick up the empty bottle out of the trash can, and I see that my other multivitamin had 15, and I was sleeping well. Each person has to make that connection for themselves. So I insist that they have certain vitamin doses and that they read the back. But I'm not really much into which supplier. I also have not been convinced that more expensive is better. The whole supplement industry is around, I'm going to brand my own. I'm going to put what I think is best in there. And what's best for one client at this phase might work well, but it may be disastrous for the next person. That means you really have to be applying these chemicals to what am I personally trying to accomplish? What have I done for the last 10 years? That sort of thing. So, and most of the people who are interested in supplements are not really into that. They just want to know what's your recommended dose. And they're not interested in trying to connect. Okay, the recommended dose depends on where you are. What are these symptoms? And how do you learn how to attach these symptoms to the dose you should take? And the fact that, one, when we're in a deficiency state, we're going to be taking more. And then when we get the microbiome back and they're producing the things that we were supposed to have for the last 20 years, you can't make up the 20-year span loss overnight. That means you have to take a little bit more for a fixed period of time. But then you will reach a point where that big dose is too much. And their body will tell you that. And then you come off of it. That's a really different way to think about vitamins and supplementing.
One of the common vitamins coupled with vitamin D is K2. Do you feel like that piece is important, or is it something you avoid or advocate for?
I address it in the FAQs. I address it on my website. The K2 is really not about deabsorption. K2 is about once the D does its work and it helps us to absorb calcium, K2 has a different responsibility where it directs the calcium into the places where it's supposed to go, and it keeps it from going to places where it's not supposed to go. So it directs the calcium into the bone instead of into your tendon attachments or into your arteries. So people who've had osteoporosis or osteopenia have bone effects of being D deficient. Therefore, I think they should take K2. People who have not had bone effects, K2 is coming from the bacteria in your gut. So bringing back the gut back to normal gut bacteria is a pivotal part of the RightSleep program. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the microbiome. So I don't recommend K2 be added specifically. It's frequently in the multivitamin as well. So under certain circumstances.
All right. I want to make sure we're clear on the type of testing to get done, because if you go to your doctor with this new information we're sharing today and you're going to aim for that 60 to 80 range for your vitamin D, the likely test you're going to get isn't the one you want. So let's talk about what that is and then what you recommend.
When I was first doing these tests, I was completely unaware of anything. And I just sent them off for vitamin D tests. And it just so happened that my lab was doing what is called a liquid chromatography mass spectroscopy D level. That is a big, huge machine that has all these different things that it does. It's $500,000 to buy that machine. Every single lab that's testing any hormone from our body, thyroid, testosterone, estrogen, has to be shot into that machine because these hormones have very specific conformations that have to be done by this machine. At the end of 10 years of doing those Ds, I started to notice that there were other doctors in my community who had decided they wanted to do D levels on their patients, and they bought a vitamin D machine, and they're using that machine, and the D levels that they were getting a week away from the ones that my patients were doing for me, these two labs were having differences of 10 or 20 points. So when I'm saying you should be between 60 and 80, and this lab that I'm using says your level is 60, and your other doctor's lab says it's 80 in the same week, that's totally different. One says we should go down, one says we should go up. And so I would call them and I would say, what's wrong with your machine? And, and they'd say, my machine is fine, and I've done all the blah, blah, blah. And it turns out that they're using these machines that are set up as immunoassays. If you picture the little tests we do for COVID, the COVID test is an immunoassay. You make a little antibody. This is something that our body makes. It's a little lock and key recognizing the COVID virus. And you put that on a piece of paper, and then you find a way to attach a color marker to it. So what you're looking at is this little tiny band with a red or a blue. That sort of thing is called an immunoassay. Because doctors started to do a whole bunch of vitamin D levels, starting at the same time that I was doing, like middle 2000s to 2015, and the doctors don't have any way of knowing what the physical manifestations of D deficiency are. So they don't know how to interpret this lab result. The labs were looking for cheaper ways to do vitamin D. So they just started to move over to immunoassays. And unfortunately, each company, like Roche makes a machine that does it, and Abbott makes a machine that does it. And they're all different antibodies, and they all have different normals. They're all supposed to be compared to this gold standard, which is the liquid LCMS technique, but they're compared within the range that usually walks through the door. So if 90% of the people who walk into the lab have a D level between 10 and 40, then they can say my immunoassay varies. It is linear. It's about the same as the gold standard. But if you go above 40, it turns out that those immunoassays are very inaccurate. And there are many journal articles showing that. The problem is in Canada, the last time that I researched this, which was probably about 4 years ago, Sick Kids in Toronto was the only hospital where even in the hospital, you could get an LCMS technique vitamin D. That was the only place. The federal established medical service will only do 1 D a year. You can pay for them in Canada. They aren't that expensive, but you will inevitably get an immunoassay. Now, the problem is that you don't have this LCMS to compare to. That means that in the US, we have the ability to get our own labs done ourselves through this private company that actually is just a online ordering system that has made a contract with Quest. So you go in and you get a Quest lab draw. They allow you to get it done for $40 and you get the results yourself. There are companies that are doing that in Canada. Unfortunately, they don't have anybody to make a contract with that really does an LCMS. So there's no advantage. Oddly enough, there is a place in Birmingham, England, that's through the National Health Service that does blood spot vitamin D levels that are all LCMS. They are very adamant about doing this particular kind of test. They know exactly what they're doing. You can get a blood spot test, and Canada and Australia both have very fast post between Canada and the UK, Australia and the UK. So sometimes I use that UK testing system with blood spots. The problem is that the turnaround time, even when the post is fast, is like 3 weeks. And if you're suffering from something and you think your D is too high or too low and you're trying to ask whether or not it should move up or down, 3 weeks is a very long time to have daily headache or back pain or burning in your feet. So the only thing you're really left with in Canada is doing the immunoassay. And what you're really going to do with that is establish your own normal. You're going to take my idea that there's a better D blood level for sleep. You're going to take our observation that there's usually about a 10-point disparity between the immunoassay reads at least about 10 points higher than the LCMS. And then you're going to see what you notice over time. You're just going to keep doing your D levels. And then you're going to write down how you feel. Because over a 2 or 3 year span, it's very difficult to look back even 2 weeks ago and know what was happening to you. So you can still do this program in Canada using the immunoassays. You will have to pay for them. And I think the last time I looked, they were like 35 Canadian dollars. They weren't horrible. Through Dynacare, and there's two big companies in Canada that do vitamin D levels, and they won't prevent you from doing them. And that's data is what you need. If you live close enough to the border that you can drive over the border and give Ulta Lab tests, which is the U.S. company, they don't really care where you are physically, and they don't compare that to where your credit card is being put on your billing site. So you can actually drive into the U.S., get an LCMS done, and compare that. So in more and more around the world, I have people who live in countries where there is no access to LCMS, where they send it into the U.S. Mexico sends it into the U.S. Brazil, there aren't any. There's only the immunoassay. So the best that you can do is actually have your own baseline numbers and see if around 60 you start to do better. Also, I should pay attention to the fact that the units in Canada are different. The units in Canada, UK, and Australia, all British colonies, use a different set of units, which means that if you go similar to mine, it's 60 to 80. For your units, it's 150 to 200.
So just to be clear, the units you're referring to are NG per milliliter, correct?
Yes.
Got it. That's important.
And yours are nanomoles and MOL per liter.
All right. Before we move into the microbiome and get deeper into all this, I want to come back to something we covered early on and make sure we go a little bit deeper into it so we're all on the same page. For somebody that's trying to get their sleep to an ideal spot, let's talk about what an ideal sleep study would be. Somebody working with you, you've talked about deep sleep, and I just want to make sure we talk about when is that person going to bed, how much of the different phases they're getting in the ideal situation. If you're holding that sleep study in front of you and you're like, this person nailed it.
One of the biggest frustrations is trying to correlate how do I feel compared to what is the objective measurement. Okay. So because I still come out of the same training, the question you asked is perfectly phrased. I should be able to look, let's just say I'm using a sleep tracker. I'm using an Aura Ring, let's say. And the Aura Ring gives me a reading every night of how much slow wave sleep, and they call it deep sleep. This is very confusing because of the terminology for the sleep experts are all sleep while you're deeper and paralyzed is called deep sleep. And that's broken into slow wave sleep, where these big slow waves happen, and REM sleep. So deep sleep has two parts, slow wave sleep and REM sleep. In all the trackers, what they give you is you had an hour and a half of deep and an hour and a half of REM. Okay. As far as I'm concerned, that's equally valid. Okay. They're still showing you for how long you were paralyzed. It comes in little blocks. If you think about it, if you were paralyzed, you're very vulnerable. That means in between, we probably wake up, we come to a higher level of a consciousness. So our brain is sensing sound, touch. It's sending messages in that say, I'm safe. And then you come back down into deep sleep again. So we do it in little blocks of time, usually somewhere between a half an hour. Sometimes it's 10 minutes. Then we do a little light sleep. And then we come back again. We do deep, and it's interspersed like that. So let's just say that you have an Oura ring that's telling you that quote unquote normal would be, I have 2 hours of deep and 2 hours of REM every night. That would be considered normal. What if I'm still fatigued after I have 2 weeks of that? And is that the way it really turns out? No, it's not the way it really turns out, because for the very first time in the world, we have normal people who are suffering from living indoors, who have a sleep disorder, who are actually wearing trackers. So this is the first time we're acquiring data. But what almost everybody notices is one night I'll have more deep and less REM. And the next night I'll have less deep and more REM. It seems that the brain moves it around. Okay. So even if I say this is the idealized normal, it doesn't ever come out exactly that way. The places where the second question is, how valid is my personal description of my sleep? And I personally think that before trackers came, I was doing this before trackers were available. I think that humans have an infinite number of things that they can tell you about their sleep. They may only choose to say, I only slept 5 hours. Everybody focuses on, did I get 8 or not? That's really not the whole story. The whole story is, when did I, these are the questions I would ask someone. They're going to be coaching with me. What time did you get sleepy? What time did you actually go to bed? How long did it take you to fall asleep? Did you sleep all the way through? If you woke up, were you able to roll over and go back to sleep? Did you get up to pee? What time did you actually wake up and stay up? And how did you feel? And then there's a whole second set of questions that refer to, how did I feel when I first woke up? Because one of the important observations that I had at the beginning, remember I was doing this with a lot of migraineurs, daily headache sufferers. Even when they went on CPAP, the way they got better was they used the CPAP for 3 weeks and they noticed that they didn't wake up with a headache, but their headache came by 10 a.m. And because I'm so biochemically oriented, I thought, oh, they made enough chemicals of whatever it is that's keeping their head pain switch in the off position, but it ran out by 10 a.m. And 2 months later, they're still using just CPAP, not a drug. 2 months later, their headache doesn't come until 5 p.m. And in another 2 weeks, it doesn't come at all. So there's another aspect to it, which is I wake up in the morning and I feel good for about an hour, and then I'm tired and cranky and I can't remember for the rest of the day. So there's a whole aspect of how long does the recovery that I've gotten during the night last during the day? Then going back to the sleep, there are lots of other details. Many of the clients that I work with never feel sleepy. Like most of the stuff that the sleep experts that are working in primary sleep research in animals and humans, they say that we build up adenosine and then by the end of the day, we have this adenosine and then we get tired and we go to sleep. Well, how does that explain the fact that I have people who never get sleepy? They're tired as hell. They've slept 2 hours a night for the last 5 years, and they never feel sleepy. Sleepiness is actually a separate state. Feeling sleepy is a warning phase. It's like, hey, Jesse, you're about to be paralyzed and unconscious. You'd like to find a place where you're going to be safe for when that happens. It's a warning phase. And I have lots of insomniacs who don't feel sleepy at all. And then when they get the raw materials back, they say, you know, what's weird? I start to, like in the last week or so, I got kind of sleepy and it was around 10 o'clock. And I went and I laid down, but I didn't go to sleep. It's a fake out. They're starting to get the right chemistry for that sleepiness phase, but the actual switching into the sleep, which is absolutely dependent on having a certain set of ratios of these neurotransmitters, is still not right. So then there's how long does it take me to fall asleep? Then there is how many times do I wake up and do I get up to pee? Because it turns out bladder function is run by the same autonomic nervous system as sleep is. So we're told that it has to do with how much we drink, but that's not true. Getting up to pee, that's about the autonomic nervous system not being right.
That's great. I want to come down from there and talk now about what is happening in these different phases of sleep. We know in the deeper sleep phases, we become paralyzed, but let's talk about physiology and repair that's happening in the body at different parts of the night.
Brilliant question. I think we're going to have to meet again to do the microbiome because you have really deep questions about this. Here's the actual fact. We have no way to get at that in the order in which you asked it. It is the logical way to ask. I mean, if you can know everything there is to know about your refrigeration as a concept, the chemicals behind it, and how many employees are at the Frigidaire factory, you can know everything that there is to know on the internet about something that man made. But we don't know any of the things you just asked. We don't really know what we're doing in those. I just had a big argument with one of my friends who's a sleep expert at the sleep meetings about whether or not we get paralyzed in deep sleep or not. She said no. And I went, wait a minute, all the sleep trackers are using an actigraphy machine, like in the ring and in the watch, to measure whether or not you're moving or not. And they're telling us we're in deep sleep and we're not moving. They've never asked that question in that way, oddly enough. And when they do the supervised sleep studies, they don't put electrodes over all of your muscles in your body. If you look at this in a different way and you say, what do we know about the anatomy of the way the nucleus that paralyzes us? How do we know that we get paralyzed? Because they went in and electrically killed the cells that do that and showed that the cats kept walking while they were in REM sleep, and they would actually have complex movements and jump on imaginary mice when they were dreaming. So that neuroanatomy is very clear. Also, the people who work in this area of neuroanatomy in fish, zebrafishes, or in insects, or oddly enough, fruit flies, they'll give you the answer that the neuroanatomy is very clear, and these are the cells, we've named them, and here's how they paralyze us. If you then ask, how does that relate to me, Jesse, and my ankle pain when I wake up? Nobody knows because nobody's asked that question in that way. So oddly enough, what happened to me was I'm sitting there with these young, healthy females, and because they aren't 90-year-old women who have osteoporosis and a million things wrong with them, I think they shouldn't have ankle pain or knee pain or hip pain. And when I'm going through what I have to give them, okay, I can understand the concept that I might give them a CPAP device and maybe that'll keep them in deep sleep longer and that'll help their brain. But that CPAP device is not doing anything for these leg movements. So what the two things that we get on these sleep studies are, oh, she stops breathing and her legs are moving an abnormal amount. But what I'm doing with the CPAP device doesn't have anything to do with those leg movements. And then you learn we're supposed to not be moving. Could that mean then that they have ankle pain because they're walking on their legs all day, but they never get into a paralyzed repair phase? Then so your question is asked in the way that we all ask, what are we doing in those phases? But the answer is being given in, what do I see in my patient? And then what do I see in the sleep study? And then I'm making up stuff. Okay. I'm really making up. You know, what's interesting is those leg movements could mean that you're being prevented from repairing your ankle. What if we can give you back some vitamins? And this is why I'm here. This is why I have a website. What if I stumble into vitamin D? And we see the sleep get better. And then we stumble into the fact that D is related to the microbiome, and the microbiome makes all these B vitamins. And we get the microbiome back, and we start to see that you don't have those leg movements anymore. And I now have 2 sleep studies. Now we have trackers. Okay, well, how much leg movement do you have now? Or how are your ankles doing? And you can actually put together the fact that, gee, it looks like the reason why we get paralyzed is to allow for complete repair of our moving parts. But that is all supposition. Medicine does not like to say, oh, Stasha's ideas, they're really cool. You and I do. Because if my medical doctor had the full answer and made my ankle pain go away, I would never be on this podcast. I would just be doing what he or she said. But when I don't get significant improvement, then we're left with, well, yes, most of this is supposition. It's very difficult to answer that question. What is it that we really do? The other thing that you can get to and put together as a physician is to say, what do we know about the repair processes in general? Okay. So for instance, there's beautiful literature about what happens to my joints. Okay. They don't say in sleep. They say, what happens to repair my joints? There are this whole class of cells that are called chondroclasts. They're similar to osteoclasts. The clast group comes around and takes off the top surface, let's say your hip joint, a ball and socket joint. Those chondroclasts come and they eat away at this smooth, beautifully contiguous set of cells that are the lining. They eat that away, so all the little pits and cracks are gone. And then the chondroblasts are the construction companies. So they're scraping off the old asphalt. And then the next group of guys come in and lays down the new asphalt. And it's nice and smooth and has this articular cartilage. We know all of those things in animal models and in single cell petri dishes, where you actually recreate the top of a bone. You make actual a joint surface grow on top of it, and you're doing it outside the human being. And you can see these cellular types and the chemicals that they use. And what happens if I throw in there an inflammatory, something that increases the inflammatory state? You can actually recreate what I think is happening in someone who's not paralyzed, which is you can see the chondroclasts come in and take off the top layer, but the chondroblast that's supposed to lay down the new asphalt is being inhibited. And then that's happening every night. That means the things that I see in my patients, like my hip just got replaced because it's bone on bone. And the doctor says, oh, I guess you walked on your hips. Like, well, what the hell else am I supposed to do? Okay. And they say, oh, I guess it's because you did too much running or you skied too much. Well, if there are 90-year-old people who are still skiing, which there are, and you can do an MRI of their hip, they don't go in to have it done, but you can show that the anatomy of it is normal. That means you can connect the dots and say, could this mean that the movement of my leg while I'm sleeping every night is inhibiting the normal function of repair? One of the problems is these things that we've taken out of the human and recreated in the lab are taken out of the context of the 24-hour day. So I would claim that what we know about how patients present is if I take away your sleep, these are the things that are going to happen to you over time, and they will slowly, progressively be worse. And there are all the chronic illnesses that we're treating now. But that also means that we could actually fix all of those, including diabetes and fatty liver and pulmonary hypertension, all these things where it's still mysterious why we have them. If we were able to reverse this process and bring it back to normal sleep, keep in mind that reversing a process where everything is come unraveled is very complex. And you then must say, I don't know how to do that. Absolutely, I don't. But the brain knows how. Then as soon as you're knitting everything back together, but there's one little piece that I didn't know about or I forgot or was specifically still low in you, like iron or choline or something else. And I am not an expert in nutrition or a naturopath. I mean, there are many, many things that I don't know about. But then you hit a wall and then you say, and this is one of the really important things about the RightSleep program is we still have these question and answer sessions where I say, this is what you do when you end the RightSleep program. But after you end that, what we're all doing is learning, is there something else that might possibly be deficient in my body that I should try? And then we do little experiments and we see whether or not that improves my sleep or my joint pain, etc.
I want to come back to vitamin D and continue that story. So we know now what we're aiming for, the range. We know how to properly test for it. We know in the central nervous system, there's receptors for vitamin D. And we know that vitamin D is having an impact on the microbiome. So continue that story. When somebody gets in that optimal range, let's talk about the physiological changes that happen in the body.
Okay, first off, vitamin D is probably being used for something specific for 80% of the cells in our body. So I'm very focused on sleep, and I still believe that I saw things in a different way because I was allowing sleep to happen. But the D is only one of millions of different chemicals. So the first thing that, and again, I want to see this through the lens of, this is a clinician watching what happens to her patients and her clients and herself, and then puzzling through what could that mean. It's very frustrating and it's inexact. So, and this will lead in then to another segment that we'll do together. So at the end of 2 years, right around the time that Walter and I were writing this article about in 2012, saying, it looks like the epidemic, the pandemic of sleep disorders around the globe is related to going indoors. And it's related to vitamin D deficiency, and it goes through the physiology of D in the brain. And D is used in many, many things in the brain that are not about sleep. And it's used in many, many other physiologic processes that are probably not relevant to what we're doing now. But the thing that happened in 2012 was all of us who were doing this program with me started to get worse again. And we had a D level that was still perfect. Mine was still 65, but my butt started to hurt. I had this weird buttock pain where I couldn't sit down at the end of the day. And I still tell that story because it's so peculiar. It didn't make any sense. I didn't follow my butt. I was still running. It was like really painful. It wasn't painful in the morning. It's not something where I'm going to go in and ask my doctor for a butt MRI. I'm like, they already think I'm nutty. My patients were coming back with, my joints all hurt. I was just sent to a rheumatologist. My feet and my hands are burning. They're all things that they didn't have when they walked in the door and started working with me. And I had become very paranoid by then because I had done things with the D-dosing and the levels that had made people worse. And I was just like, every single thing that anybody told me about anything, I thought was related to vitamin D, because I really felt like this is really weird stuff. I don't know what I'm doing, and I should take responsibility for it. I may not know what to do. At that point, especially the burning in the hands and feet, I knew was very unusual. My subspecialty interest is neuropathy. I've been doing that for 30 years. I actually had much more training in that than I did in headache or sleep. And I know that burning in the hands and feet just doesn't walk in the door. And I had 2 women who didn't know each other, had nothing else in common. The only thing they've been doing is taking D with me for 2 years. Both had burning in the hands and feet at the same time, like within a month of each other, 2 years after starting D. This is getting more and more common, especially since COVID. A person brings me a book about another B vitamin, B5, pantothenic acid, and she brought it to me because the woman was treating patients who had rheumatoid arthritis. But when she gives this B5, it makes their sleep better. So she knew I was a fanatic about sleep, and that's why she brought it to me, not because I'm a rheumatologist, because I wasn't interested in the joint pain. So I go to the references of that book and find that she's referencing articles from the 1950s who made people artificially B5 deficient using a blocker, a chemical blocker of pantothenic acid. And the 4 things they get within 2 weeks of taking that blocker is a funny gait, a puppet-like gait, insomnia, burning in the hands and feet, and some numbness, and belly complaints. And it's at that point that I think, oh my God, I've really encouraged repair to happen. And again, I think I see this differently because I'm seeing it through the lens of sleep. I'm encouraging sleep. Therefore, I'm encouraging repair. I'm not encouraging to be unconscious and just lie there. I want repair to happen. That's when we're going to feel better. I'm encouraging this to happen. And there are other vitamins that are in the background that are needed, that are the building blocks of every single cellular repair. And now what's happened is they've run up against, their stores have run out. And then the next question is, why would they be B vitamin deficient? If all the B vitamins come from the food, these people are people who are interested in what they're doing with their health. They haven't changed their diet. They're these two people who have nothing to do with each other. This is not about diet. Something else is wrong. And I read these review articles about B vitamins. And by this time in 2013, and starting in about 2010, all the review articles about the B vitamins are saying, oh, thiamine, B1, has a poop bacteria source and a food source. B2, riboflavin, has a poop bacteria source and a food source. It's not like I made this up. I'm reading these review articles, and they all say, wait, all 8 of these, and oh, wait, why are there 8 Bs? Like, what's up with that? They describe A, and then there are 8 things called B, and then there's C and D. Why would there be 8 things called B? And it's because they were all found together. And they were all found together in this fermentation bowl. They were found in a this means that it's connected to all the literature about fermented food now. So in the meantime, I'm not a GI doctor, but the microbiome has begun to take on a whole different significance within medicine. And that means that when I'm reading this, I think, oh, well, most of these people have IBS. So we've been assuming that their microbiome is wrong because of the antibiotics. But what if it's not that? What if really, and I've been taking probiotics for 5 years and I didn't feel any better and they didn't feel any better. Is it possible that it's the D deficiency that caused their microbiome to change? And that's really the truth. And that's been shown now since then. And really since 2020, COVID made a lot of things much clearer because they started to have these articles that were linked to D. And 2020 was the first article to actually where someone said, okay, we're going to change the D supply to these 25 people, and then we're going to measure what's in their poop, which bacteria are in their poop. And we show that the good bacteria are better in the person who has a higher D level and a higher D dose. So there is a connection to the loss of our microbiome that really wasn't about antibiotics. Antibiotics are actually what bacteria make. Bacteria, fungus, viruses make antiviral, antibacterial, antifungal chemicals that kill off their competitors. That means that the groups that we had of all 3 of those types of organisms on and in us were acting as our protectors until we moved indoors and we lost them because we are really in a symbiotic relationship with them. We give them D, they give us the various things that they give us. So that takes us into the next discussion, which turns out to be the B vitamins and all the minerals that come with the help of the microbiome are pivotal for normal sleep. You cannot sleep normally just by getting your D level in line. You must get those guys back, and then you must learn a little bit about how to manipulate those other chemicals and how to tell whether or not they're low and affecting your sleep.
I know a piece of this puzzle too is the acetylcholine. Is that from the microbiome back to the brain?
It is a pivotal part of this, and it takes, I'm going to have a hard stop at 3 your time. So I prefer to do it in the next segment, and I'll actually show an equation for you because it's both D. D provides the enzyme, B5 and choline are necessary, and they add together to make the acetylcholine. That means you have to have all of those pieces to get the right outcome.
Okay, let's do that. We'll end here, and maybe we can pick up and record for another hour and piece them together to get the full picture here, because I think it's important we include that with this to give the full story to people that have been tuned into this point. So we'll end that here. We'll continue the conversation. And then at the end of that, we'll put on in the show notes, we'll make sure and link up to your website, your social media, everything like that.
Great.
So thank you for this.
Thank you, Jesse.
We'll continue soon. And then we'll piece this together and give a comprehensive idea for people of this whole vitamin D microbiome sleep equation. Thank you.
Jesse, you're really smart. You're asking really good questions, and you're doing a great job of coalescing it into a final statement. That was very well done.
Stasha, we're going to jump right back in. We ran out of time, but we have more to talk about. We got to get back into this. And last time we wrapped up talking about acetylcholine, and we're going to really take our time, unpack that. But a piece of this is the B vitamin, specifically B5, and vitamin D coming together to make acetylcholine. So before we get deeper into acetylcholine, I think we should talk about the B vitamins as a whole. B12 came up before, but let's talk about them as a complex. And then specifically this role of B5. And then we'll move on from there.
I'm going to ask to start just a little bit earlier than that because my idea has changed the way, let me say this. My experience with my patients changed the way I looked at the B vitamins. And I want to open with that about the microbiome. So our first episode, we covered the fact that D had a lot to do with sleep. After 2 years, the improvement in sleep went away and many of us started to have new symptoms. And just to shorten it quite a bit, someone brought me a book about a B vitamin. I knew nothing about the B vitamins. I started to read about them. The review articles about the B vitamins at that time, which was 2013, so about 10 years ago, usually cover the fact that each one of the B vitamins have an intestinal bacteria source and a food source. After reading that a couple of times, I thought, well, the thing that's weird about what just happened to all my patients was by taking D and sleeping better, it appears I've forced them into a new deficiency state. And if the Bs really come from the food and they haven't changed their diet, that doesn't make much sense to me. But the other thing that was pretty constant in the background was that most of the people that I was treating that had daily headache and sleep disorders based on their sleep studies also had irritable bowel symptoms. Maybe a third of them had been diagnosed as irritable bowel. Plus, we had become more and more aware of the fact that other ways of testing our microbiome have shown that a lot of the population has the wrong microbiome. That idea was being put forward by the GI doctors at the time, and still they're claiming it's because of the use of antibacterial agents. I don't think that's really the case, and I'm going to tell you why. So as I read these review articles about the Bs, I think, well, if they have the wrong poop bacteria, and I think D was the thing that went low and kept the poop bacteria from being correct. We lost the poop bacteria at the same time that we started to have sleep disorders, and at the same time that D went low. The first question would be, how come I gave D for 2 years, but their bacteria didn't get better? Because their IBS did not correct. So then I'm reading these articles about the Bs, and I'm thinking, well, what else could those little guys inside us want in order to come back? Why haven't they just popped back and everybody's healthy the way I expected, as magical? So I thought, well, maybe these 8 B vitamins are actually bacterial growth factors. And in fact, that is the case. When you look in the history of why it is we have vitamin A, and then we have 8 things called B, which is really peculiar. Like, why? Why would there be? It took me probably 5 years before I even asked that question. Why would there be 8 things called B? And it turns out because they actually isolated these 8 chemicals. These were the first chemicals that were described as bacterial growth factors. And they were described in a setting way back in the 20s and 30s when doctors were actually interested in vitamins, and they would pour something into a petri dish and let it grow and watch bacteria and look at them under the microscope and name them after themselves and things like that. And what they had done without realizing it is they used a yeast bacterial mixture that was at the time being used to make beer and bread to pour into the petri dish and watch the bacteria grow. At first, they did it by accident. And then after a while, it became the routine. And then they began to realize that if they boiled it, if they didn't get it in the exactly right temperature, by the way, the temperature that we use if you've ever made beer or bread, you have to be very careful about that yeast bacteria mixture. If they boiled it, some of the bacteria wouldn't grow. And out of those experiments grew the idea that there must be chemicals within this yeast bacteria mixture. By the way, that is very similar to kefir or sauerkraut or fermented foods, which has become a very pertinent movement about bringing back the microbiome. Okay, so the very beginning of this whole story, somebody grew these in a petri dish using these bacterial growth factors without realizing there was such a thing. And the idea of bacterial growth factors actually came before the idea of vitamin. So first, if I put this thing, and then they actually isolated each one of these chemicals, and each one of them had a certain name, and then they chemically isolated them. And one of the confusing things is there's a B12, even though most people say there are only 8 B vitamins. Well, that's confusing. And it turns out that there are other chemicals that we found that humans could make on their own. Then we said these B vitamins come from the food. That was an idea that followed afterwards. So the first question would be, are my patients people who lost their D level, therefore couldn't sleep, and at the same time that they had this direct effect on the brain stem and the sleep switches, also lost their microbiome? Could it be that when I give back these 8 growth factors, I've just given them B50 by accident, really? I reached for the Bs. I thought, we should give them all as 8 because that's the way they came from the poop bacteria in the first place. And because I remembered from medical school, if you give one B, you should give all of them. That is not the current dogma, but that's what it was in the 80s. So I give back this thing called B50. B50 is a combination of all 8, 50 milligrams or 50 micrograms. So it describes the dose. I've given that by mistake, but it turns out that that's what made my patients better at this point where we had gotten better with D. Now we're doing badly again. And they give B50 and their pain, I give the B50 completely naively, and their pain goes away. My pain goes away and our sleep gets better. So there's something magical about this combination of 8 Bs. At the time, I'm not only invested in their sleep getting better, but I'm invested in the fact that I don't think that humans were made to take vitamins. This whole combination of B50, that's a human creation. If all the animals on this planet have been receiving these growth factors from the microbiome, then the key of this whole thing is, 1, being outdoors, getting your D from the sunlight, and having a normal microbiome that provides all of these other growth factors. Keep in mind that all the other animals that we know of on the planet, there are hundreds of species of reptiles and insects, etc. They are all receiving these B vitamins from their poop bacteria. Yet they don't go to GNC. That means that's what I want for my patients. I want them to get back to the natural state where we don't have to take supplements. So it works to give B50. And then I start thinking, well, if these are the 8 growth factors that the 4 specific species, so in the meantime, I'm reading a lot of articles about, and there's one article that's on my website that's out of the Economist Journal. That's a very, very good summary of all the things that the GI doctors were talking about at that time. Things like, if you do a gastric bypass on a mouse, and then you take some of the poop from that mouse and you transplant it into another mouse that's bacteria-free, the second mouse loses weight. Well, that's bizarre. My patients want to lose weight. So there are all these new ideas that are popping up all around 2013 that now don't seem that new. Fecal transplant, transplanting poop from one person to another, that was ridiculous. At the time, I was like, only a doctor would come up with anything that bizarre. We just spent 100 years trying to teach people to stay away from the poop, not get it on their body, all this stuff. We vilified that poop, but we've discovered that if you transplant the poop, you want to know who your donor is, because if your donor's fat, you're going to get fat. If your donor's skinny, you're going to be skinny. So these several ideas put it in my head that the most important part of all of this is not only getting the D to be at an I live outdoors level, but also to get the microbiome right. And because of that, and I'm adding now D and these 8 B vitamins, I start telling my patients, if I'm right about this, I think your microbiome is going to grow back. And then, because I don't really know the dose of each one of these 8 chemicals that is naturally provided by the microbiome, nobody really does. And it's going to be almost impossible to get to that. So I say, I think it's helping you, but just let's say that a few months go by and your pain and your sleep disruption comes back. I want you to stop this B50, and here's why. If I'm right and all the healthy, helpful foursome of phyla grow back, they are going to start producing the right amount. That means you're all of a sudden, without your knowledge, on double the dose. My patients, when I gave them too much of this B5 we're going to talk about, became sleepless and pain was bad. So I knew that if we overdosed, and again, I don't know what the dose is, but I'd already had an accidental experience where I gave too much. So in fact, what happened was after 3 months, my patients started to come back and say, my pain went away. I felt great. I slept better. And then in the last 2 weeks, it's all started to fall apart again. So they stopped the B50. I was too dumb to do that because I'm not listening to my own advice. And I started to get pain again and a weird diffuse stiffness when I would wake up, like feeling old. That's the one I felt. I felt old. And that turned out to be, I'm on too big a dose of these Bs. Now, in the background, one of the things that prompted me to give this B50 was I had a couple of patients who walked in the door with burning in their hands and feet, which is really peculiar. And the literature supports the idea that if you take away B50, and this literature is from the 1950s, if you take away B5, and this was a patient who brought me a book, it was not something I would have ever thought of because I'm not interested in vitamins. She had brought me a book about it and said, gee, their sleep got better when they got B5. So B5 is one of the vitamins that has been completely overlooked. In the last 40 years, what all of the books say is there is no pantothenic acid deficiency because it's in every food. And that turns out to be basically a lie. They didn't mean to lie, but they made some assumptions that weren't correct. They measured the coenzyme A levels in all the food and said there's lots of it in there. And then they assumed that we would break down coenzyme A into its various parts and B5 would be part of it. And that is not what happens. The only B5 that we bring into our body, and it turns out that the pump that pumps it in at the GI tract is the same pump that pumps it in at the brain. And it must be in a very specific configuration. B5 is what's called a chiral molecule. It comes in a right-handed form and a left-handed form. You must have the right-handed form. The bacteria are the only source. And therefore, we, by supposition and by lots of experience with now 8,000 patients, when where D went low and we lost our microbiome, we all became B5 deficient to various degrees. That B5 is a pivotal piece in making a chemical called acetylcholine that you introduced for this particular part of the lecture. So I did not know anything about why any of these good things were happening to my patients. I was just thrilled because their pain went away. I didn't understand what the mechanism of that was. Their sleep got better. I knew that pain and sleep were attached. And at the beginning, I just am doing things blindly because it worked in my patients. Then I'm stuck with, I'm not happy with just doing this blindly. I want to know why. And if I'm going to give a lecture about it, I want to know what the real chemical is. And because when I gave too much, it made people agitated and unable to sleep. It was acting like caffeine. And what I would tell my patients is, don't take too much of this. This is the right dose, etc. But then I started into the literature about what is it that B5 makes in the brain. The book that the gal in my practice had actually given me had used B5 in 400 milligram doses, which was way too much for my patients, it turned out, to treat rheumatoid arthritis because B5 becomes coenzyme A. Coenzyme A must be present to make cortisol in the adrenal gland. But I knew what I was doing with taking their pain away and making their sleep better was not just cortisol. They might be making cortisol, but it was so quick. Their pain would go away in a day. It was so weird. And we're going to come back to that at the end as to acetylcholine being heavily, heavily embedded in the inflammatory system in our body. So now I have a good explanation for why it was so quick. But at the time, so I went searching for what does B5 or coenzyme A make in the brain? And what came up was acetylcholine. And the weird part about that is, and I'm a neurologist, the word acetylcholine is not something that any of your audience has ever thought about before, but I'm a neurologist and I should know about it. But acetylcholine, in my mind, brings up myasthenia gravis and the neuromuscular junction, and it is the neurotransmitter that makes the muscles move. The only other place it's really prominent in neurology is in Alzheimer's disease. So when you lose your acetylcholine in the brain, you start having trouble with your memory. That's not what happens to these people. They didn't have extra acetylcholine making them like contract their muscles and not able to move. They didn't have either one of those things. They didn't have a memory problem. They didn't have muscles moving weird. What they had was they felt agitated and unable to sleep when the dose was too high. They felt calm, focused, and great, and they slept great when the dose was perfect, and their pain went away. Two separate things in my mind. How is the pain related to this, and why does it go away so fast? So over a span of time, I began to read articles about what is acetylcholine responsible for in the brain. And it is one of the pivotal neurotransmitters that allows us to transition through the normal phases of sleep and to become paralyzed correctly. And that's in the literature since the 60s. It's not the only neurotransmitter, but it appears that all the other neurotransmitters that everybody else is talking about in sleep. So if you go to the sleep meetings and you sit there and you hear various experiments in humans and mice and rats, they're talking about norepinephrine and epinephrine and serotonin and dopamine and melatonin and GABA. They're talking about all these neurotransmitters. Nobody's saying anything about acetylcholine. And I'm sitting in the audience thinking, there's no way that I could have just fallen into this by accident. But it turns out I did. And the reason why it is not talked about at the sleep study centers and why it's not talked about at the meetings is because we have no drugs that duplicate it. So one of the first things that I thought of when I said acetylcholine, why don't I know what acetylcholine does in the brain aside from memory? And I started going through, well, how do I know what serotonin does? Because I give serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the antidepressants I've been using really since the 90s of the serotonin. My patients come back and say, I feel more satisfied. And I take dopamine for my restless legs. And it turns out that as a clinician, I've really learned what these neurotransmitters do, not by reading the textbook, but by repeatedly seeing what my patients have as experience. And it turns out there are no drugs that mimic acetylcholine. Now, why is that weird? Well, why? Why aren't there? There's only one, nicotine. Nicotine has been present for hundreds of years. And in actual fact, in the early 1900s, when they start to study how nerves work, they have just a few drugs. One of them is nicotine. It's been isolated from tobacco. And when we first learned pharmacology, which is the study of drugs and their actions in medical school in the 70s, the first thing we learn is that acetylcholine has nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. That means it acts at certain subsets of receptors. And it turns out that there are now many diseases that we think are normal. ADD, ADHD, autism, distractibility in people who haven't even gotten the diagnosis of ADD. Those things are all being described by the primary neuroscientists as being deficiencies of actions of the nicotinic receptors. They are, in fact, acetylcholine deficiency states. Same with Alzheimer's disease, same with Parkinson's disease. So some of them are diseases that develop over a long span of time in the elderly, but a lot of them are presenting really early in life, within the first few years of life, in fact. So over a long span of time, I start to realize that there are many, many diseases, especially the increased anxiety. Anxiety is a direct feeling that we experience when our acetylcholine level isn't right. And I'd actually induced that in my patients by giving them a dose of B5 that was too high. But what I realized was, much like we talked about with vitamin D, where too little and too much looks the same in terms of what you feel. The same thing happens with B5. Too much and too little causes anxiety and agitation and an inability to sleep. So anybody who's had a sleep disorder that feels like I can't sleep, I can't fall asleep, I can't stay asleep, and anxiety, they've had really a B5 deficiency state that they've been feeling all along. And then if you go to the literature and you say, what's the incidence of anxiety and inability to sleep in kids and teenagers compared to the 1960s, you then realize that this has been increasing over the last 40 years and is now epidemic because there is no drug that duplicates it. And we're afraid of using nicotine. And oddly enough, many of the neuroscientists at the end of their article where they say this inability to get distracted and come back exactly where you left off and continue your work is an acetylcholine deficiency. We really should not be giving Adderall or all the other amphetamine type drugs because they are increasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're really not duplicating what we're missing. And at the end of the article, they say we really should be giving nicotine. Well, I'm not going to be able to use that clinically. I'm not going to tell my moms that they should give their kids nicotine patches or nicotine cigarettes because we've taught each other that it's dangerous stuff. And in fact, it is. But that means I'm left with no drug, but I know how to do it with vitamins just by accident. Okay. When I make a mistake and I watch this anxiety being produced in a day and 13 or 14 people tell me exactly the same, using the same words, I got so revved up and so agitated, even if it's not in the literature, I know that clinically that's what's happening to these people. Let me stop there and ask if you have any comments or questions.
Yeah, I got to jump in and I need some clarification on the microbiome piece. This is very nuanced and I'm still a little bit unclear. So to take it from the top, if you have a vitamin D deficiency, that impacts the microbiome. You top that back up, getting to that 60 or 80, and then people are able to sleep for a couple of years. All of a sudden, they can't sleep anymore. You give them a B50, and they can sleep for a couple of months, and then they're in a position again where they're having trouble. Part of it that's really confusing is the fact that when we give D, we're assuming we're fixing the microbiome. And I know you talked on this, but I'm still a little unclear. Why at that point, 2 years in, do we need to give B50 if we fix the microbiome and the microbiome is making the B vitamins? And then I want to take it from there. I have a few other questions just to work through this part because it is very detailed.
Jesse, that is the first big stumbling block. And that's what happened to me. Why didn't the microbiome come back with the sleep coming back? And I didn't have a good answer. But I understand that their IBS was not fixed and we're all getting worse. So then I thought my major question was, what do those little suckers want? I mean, why are they so picky? If the D was the thing that led to the cascade of losing them, why isn't D bringing them back? Okay. So my thought was, well, really what we're talking about when we talk about the microbiome is what are the phyla of bacteria that you have constantly reproducing in your GI tract? And you must think of them as bacteria are reproducing every day and making daughter bacteria, granddaughter bacteria, multiple generations. And that's turning over very fast. And there are specific species that are at the very beginning of the GI tract. Really, we have certain species in our mouth, in our esophagus, actually in the stomach, and in the small intestine, and along this long thing. Most of the researchers are talking about the poop bacteria as being the poop that you produce coming out finally out of your rectum. But the makeup of that particular bacterial species down there is not the same as along this route. Okay, it's quite complex. Now, in the background, what I'm assuming is, well, when we lost our D source, because we're supposed to trade, we're supposed to give D to the microbiome and they give us Bs in exchange. When we gave it D, there are still a whole bunch of bacteria down there who really don't need D, and they are still the dominant phyla, okay? And what I didn't give them was the 8 growth factors that this 4 phyla. So you have to ask a second question, which is, this is the way I phrased it to myself. Why are there 4 phyla? And only those 4 phyla? Could it be that those 4 are actually a symbiotic foursome that are exchanging B vitamins with each other? And actually, just before I publish my article that talks about this, there's another way of looking at it that I won't go into, but there are other articles that come at this question in a slightly different way. We know that those 4 phyla are the healthy ones. Could it be that the reason why it's always that foursome is because one of them gives a B vitamin that 2 others need? 2 of them make B vitamins that number 1 needs, that they all exist together because they need other Bs. So the thing that's missing when I give D for 2 years is these Bs. So I've encouraged some of the bacteria who need D to come back, but I haven't successfully converted to the foursome that we really need. And the foursome we need requires these 8 cofactors all together for the foursome to grow back.
Okay, let me jump in. I think I get what you're saying here, and I just want to make sure I do before we move forward. The fact that D is allowing some growth to happen down there, and if these 4 phyla are exchanging B vitamins as they start to repopulate, unless you're giving the B50, in the beginning as they're rebuilding, what they need may not be there because the D wasn't there, things went dormant, and now you're just starting things back up. And we need to give them what they need to fully repopulate and then to self-sustain themselves and then do that exchange between one another. Is that correct?
In fact, you're building a B vitamin soup. You're providing a D, B, all 8 Bs in large dose. Because keep in mind, the other thing is, if someone takes D and then a multivitamin with tiny doses of Bs, their body is actually sucking up all the Bs. So they don't really have enough extra for the microbiome to get the amount that they need. And that happened by accident, but it worked. And then there's a specific period of time. At the 3-month mark, you have to stop, because if you don't, you will start to get these same symptoms you had to begin with. So there was an idea there that means several things. One, it means that there are survivors of that foursome. Okay, they're there. They're just not the predominant bacteria. And what's also going to happen in somebody who's been profoundly affected is there's going to be a battle going on between the newcomers who have the growth factors they need and the old group that used to be the dominant, and they're trying to keep their territory. So there's a lot of mix up in the belly in the first month and the second month, especially in people who are profoundly deficient. And many of those people cannot tolerate B50. And someone who's been profoundly deficient for a long time, who had severe IBS, they will not be able to tolerate large dose Bs. I don't think it's actually the bees themselves hurting the inside of the belly, because our belly really was created or evolved billions of years after these 4 phyla of bacteria were hanging out together. So there are several things that are important. One, the bacteria are the ones that have determined these biochemical pathways that all of us have. Bacteria are like the mitochondria that everybody talks about now as having certain demands. So that means these bacteria have been existing on this planet for 2 billion years, making these chemical moves, hanging out as a foursome before multi-celled organisms actually come on the planet. And then the reason why our biology requires them is because biology always takes a shortcut. If we got these bugs inside us making these 8 chemicals, why would we need to make them? Okay, so you look at it in a slightly different way and then say, what I'm looking for as a clinician is explanations. I'm making up stories, right, left, and center. But I'm looking for explanations that fit with what this bigger picture is, which is what happens to my patients when I give this? Why are some of them just not able to take B50 right away? Why is B50 making them agitated and making their belly all unhappy? So a lot of these explanations are not based on measuring poop bacteria species, okay? There are a lot of companies measuring those and making money off it. It's not helpful. What is helpful is to picture this through an evolutionary lens, where you say all these other animals that live outside haven't gone through the epidemic that we as humans and our pets, by the way, that are kept inside have gone through. Okay, we're doing something slightly different. And now I'm stepping into this thing that worked by itself. And we have to still look for, if I'm doing the right thing, it should have just happened on its own. Then when I'm putting it back together, I have to think of it that way. There's some issues about that when we talk later. And that kind of fits in with the idea that just giving D didn't work. And in actual fact, what you need is D plus B50. And then there are a few other things. Let me stop then and let you finish with any other questions that aren't answered in your mind.
Yeah. So I believe you said for a couple of years, just on vitamin D, people's sleep would improve. And you mentioned the fact that you're making this story up, quote unquote, to fill in the blanks. But what are you assuming is happening there in that 2-year period of time before you start to give Bs that allows them to sleep?
Okay, so here's what my perception was. Everybody got better. I got better. I have biochemical articles that clearly show vitamin D receptors, and that those vitamin D receptors actually make acetylcholine when they're touched. But then I've actually produced things that patients didn't have. Keep in mind that they all came in, most of them came in with headaches, and they didn't have generalized joint pain, and they didn't have burning in their hands and feet. I'm creating a situation where the brain is actually using up their B vitamin stores. That's the second dogmatic statement we've made. You can't hurt anyone with Bs because you pee out the excess, and we don't have B vitamin stores. That is a lie. There are several scientific articles that describe scientific experiments that really confirm that we have several Bs, B5, B6, B1, C, those are all water soluble, but absolutely we have stores of them. That means I've increased, and again, you have to see it through this lens of sleep and repair. What I want is improved repair by sleeping better. So they sleep better, they make these repairs, all the cellular repairs we want require a complement of all 8 Bs, plus minerals, plus all these essential elements that we call vitamins and minerals. As I make those repairs, I'd use them up. So, for instance, the gals who come in with burning in the hands and feet, my subspecialty interest was neuropathy. So I spent most of my neurology career seeing patients with nerve disorders. But over that 20-year span, I had maybe 2 people who came in with burning in their hands and feet. That just doesn't happen commonly. And yet 2 of my patients, who the only thing they have in common is they've been taking D for 2 years, walk in the door, they don't have diabetes, they both have burning in their hands and feet, and it's both within a month of each other. That suggests that I, in what I'm trying to do naively, have depleted their B vitamin stores and produced a different disease. Okay. That's in my mind because my butt hurts also. I'm like, why would my butt hurt? That's not something that anybody ever has. I sit on my butt for the last 50 years and now it hurts. Okay. These are peculiar things. And it turns out that what I've done is I've produced a specific B5 deficiency state. It's not alone because the other 8 have to be there in order for it to work. But it turns out that the only other thing that's ever helped that burning stuff was B12. These 2 gals, and that was my experience as a neurologist, and there are other articles about it. These 2 gals are already on B12. So I've actually done an experiment where I've given D plus B12 in someone who's B12 deficient. That's one of them I can measure. So I've given back 1 out of 8, and I've produced this new disease. And now going back to those 1950s articles, when I read them, the reason why I started with B50 in the first place is those articles are describing blocking B5 in a small group And in 2 weeks, if you block the B5, what you produce is insomnia, belly complaints, a funny gait, weird walking stuff, and burning in the hands and feet. So I've actually, in another way, duplicated that experiment. It's not that I blocked it. It's that I've given back partial Bs, whatever Bs you can actually get from food, which some of them you probably can. But I haven't given back the one that I believe is only made by the poop bacteria. So I've produced a bunch of people with B5 deficiency and creepy, very uncomfortable burning. And when I give back this 400 milligrams of B5 that's described in this book that I was brought by my patients, the burning goes away immediately. So the 2 gals with burning have immediate resolution of it. When I take 400 milligrams, start to have more and more restless legs. So my side effect was not exactly a sleep disorder per se, but my restless legs is worse, which turns out to be related to acetylcholine also. And then when I drop down to the B50 or B100, everything goes away. My butt pain goes away in a day. Really peculiar stuff. Then over the next several years, I have to come up with explanations that are based in scientific experiment or use the scientific experiment in a slightly different way to explain these things.
Okay, I want to highlight something you brought up there, this myth that we can't store B vitamins. B12, I believe conventional medicine would say that is one we can store and looks at that one a bit different than the other 7. But you're saying there is storage of these other ones. Am I correct on that, with the B12 being looked at a little bit differently?
Yes. I'm happy to talk about B12, but this is pretty complicated too, okay? If I say that all 8 are made by the poop bacteria, then why was I trained that B12 deficiency is an inability to absorb B12 from the food? So back in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, we were trained that, so we find out that, let me tell you what the final outcome is, and then I'll tell you how we went wrong. In actual fact, this is linked to some concepts about how primates went from being fruit and berries and leaf eaters, and then we came out of the trees and we started to eat meat. That's weird for primates. Now, it turns out that some of the mutations that happen in various species along the way have a role to play. And we were originally taught that B12 comes predominantly from meat. Therefore, if we're going to say that these vitamins come from meat, that we should look for B12 deficiency in vegetarians. Then we find that some of the B12 deficiency states have to do with a lack of a specific binding protein, okay? So there's another background, which is there are actually a complex set of chemicals that help B12 be absorbed. So B12 really does come from meat. So we eat the meat, we chew it. There's a cofactor called haptocorin that's made in the saliva that binds to the B12 and actually takes it it protects it down the esophagus and into the acid environment of the stomach. And then there's a second binding protein called intrinsic factor. It is secreted by the same cells that secrete acid that dissolve the meat. That intrinsic factor binds to the B12 and it actually takes it all the way to the end of the small intestine. And there's a special absorptive portion of what's called the ileum where those 2 cofactors play a role in absorbing. Now, the thing that's against that, so we were all taught that once you can't get a B12 level up in your blood, it means that you have attacked the intrinsic factor producing cells in your stomach as an autoimmune disease, and you will never be able to make B12 go up in your blood. You permanently have to take shots. That was the dogma actually up to the time in 2011 when I also started to send my patients for B12 shots. So at the beginning of all this thing, I told you about the young gal who was B12 deficient. So I'm still thinking of it that way. Now, what's happened in the meantime is it turns out that there were lots of articles out of Europe in the 1990s that said this whole idea that you're permanently B12 deficient and you have to take shots does not stand up to the following experiment. We gave 1,000 micrograms, which is not available in food. It's 10 micrograms or 12 micrograms in a piece of meat. 1,000 micrograms is a huge dose, but we have that easily available in supplements. And if you give 1,000 micrograms to a whole bunch of people, you can bring their B12 level up. You have to give 1,000 micrograms a day. That implies that you can be deficient in the intrinsic factor. And there are two methods of absorbing B12. One is a simple diffusion that we haven't really found the pump or whatever. But if you give enough, you will bring the blood level back to where it should be. Okay. I had read that literature, but I didn't want to take a chance because I really wasn't that knowledgeable. So at the beginning of this, I started to give B12 shots or ask the internist to do that. Then my patients started to come back and say, I give my shot and then a week later I go back to my doctor and we do the blood level again and it's gone. My level is 200 again, which is really low. Where do we store this? And I say, really, the dogma is that we don't store it. It's in a little water vial, that this is water soluble. But there's this other literature that suggests, and what we were giving as that single shot was 1,000 microgram. It was supposed to last the whole month. But it turns out the reason why we gave it once a month was because Medicare paid for it once a month at the doctor's office, not because of the biology. There wasn't any thoughtfulness to this, okay? So in the background, I had already started at the same time I did D to give 1,000 micrograms a day of B12 through this whole program. That means I had already treated some of the deficiency states, but I hadn't treated the other 7 Bs, all right? Now, it turns out also, before I really learned much about the final outcomes of what we're going to talk about, some of my patients, 4 or 5 years into RightSleep, come back and say, well, my D is 65. I feel great. And I say, are you still on your B12? Because your B12 was 200 when we started this. And they say, no, I'm not taking it. And I said, well, how's your sleep? Great. I said, okay, let's do your B12 level again. And their B12 is now 500. They're not on the supplement, yet they've converted back to being a normal B12 blood level. That means maybe what we're really watching in the stomach is, and this is what I think the truth is happening, when the D goes low, the D receptors for the salivary glands that make saliva and make haptocorin, when the D goes low, those salivary glands aren't making haptocorin. The D also is pivotal in making acid in the stomach. That means most of the people who have reflux, they have reflux because D has 3 separate receptors. The 2 sphincters that keep the acid from going up into the esophagus, keep it nicely contained in the stomach, which is designed for acid, and keep it from dumping, controls the dumping into the small intestine. So if the esophageal sphincter is weak because the D is too low, then they get acid going up into the esophagus and they get bad symptoms. But the amount of acid that those same people are actually secreting is too low. They feel like it's too much. This is also why H. pylori shows up in that same population, because that is a specific bacteria that cannot grow in a stomach that's able to get to a pH or a high acid, a pH of 2.5. If we were designed to be able to dissolve meat, that happens in the stomach. It's true that we chew it, but the ability to dissolve it is related to being able to make a pH of 2.5. So that many of the people that I was treating also had reflux and were on proton pump inhibitors or H2 blockers. That means that really what was happening was the D was going up, and the ability to now make intrinsic factor and make enough acid is coming back to normal. So that it's really B12 deficiency, there's always a D low state in the background. That's not ever been published. And I actually haven't written about that yet. But that is my belief. Okay. It's even more complex than that. But one of the things that's important about this whole RightSleep program is B12 has already been described as being pivotal for normal sleep. That's in the literature. That's why I don't make a big deal out of it. But if you try to do this program without attending to the B12, it doesn't work. You have to get the B12 level up to 1,000 micrograms a day if they have a B12 level that's lower than 500. So there's some dogmatic things about B12 that are also completely wrong throughout medicine at the moment. Also, it turns out that I set the level of 500 nanograms per liter for B12 as the American level completely arbitrarily, because I began to do things like give shots to somebody who had a B12 level of 320. That was considered to be normal. And I thought, why am I waiting until they become demented and a wreck? I'm told to do the B12 level in someone who's admitted to the hospital and can't remember anything. But I'm not told to look for that on the person who's on the track to arrive there. Therefore, is it possible that people who have B12 levels in the 300s, the lab says, your doctor said it's normal, but it's really not. So I set 500 as an arbitrary, I want to overtreat a little. It also turns out that Japan in the 60s decided they were going to set their B12 level normal, a lower limit of normal, at 500. I didn't know that at the time, but they take credit for the fact that their populations are longer lived with less incidence of Alzheimer's, and the onset is later based on that B12 lower limit of normal being 500. So there's some really big aspects of this that need to change within medicine. That's one of the problems with me trying to publish this. There's so many different ideas that are based on clinical observation. That means I have to try to find the scientific articles that support it. Surprisingly, since 2020, there are a whole rash of articles that support the things that I published in 2016 that were completely hypotheses. So this piece that you and I are talking about today, I published in 2016 with several little pieces of it discussed. We're going to talk about inflammation as something separate. But the idea that in order to bring the microbiome back, we have to give D plus B50, that the microbiome is the real source of all ABs, that all of that is linked to the inflammatory states, heart disease, stroke, atherosclerotic buildup, pulmonary hypertension, which has no etiology at the moment, and widespread wearing down of joints, inflammatory disease, everything that we call inflammatory now, including allergy and asthma, all this autoimmune diseases, all of those are linked to this cascade of events. Okay. It's really too much to put in one article. Since 2020, there are now articles published in 2020 that say we took a bunch of people who had low D. We gave this group this much D, followed their D level, and this other group, we didn't give them D. And then we followed which bacteria were established in their GI tract. So the first article that actually did it in humans and said your D level establishes whether you have the healthful, happy bacteria. So they showed a change. This is back to your original question. There was a change in the microbiome when I gave D, but it wasn't really all the way back to normal. Okay. The second one is really important set of articles that started in 2020 that show B5 deficiency states in the brain at pathology, where they're actually studying pieces of the brain in someone who's died, and they look at the cell itself and are not focusing on the genome, on the DNA and the nucleus, but instead what's present in the cytoplasm and showing that there's B5 deficiency. I didn't think anybody was going to look at that. And the first article was done by accident. They found that there was a B5 deficiency in the parts of the brain that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. This same group, that PowerPoint I sent you has the actual references of everybody who's looking at this. That same group then made the next logical statement, which was, wait a minute, every book that we read says that there is no such thing as B5 deficiency because it's in every food. Why is it we're finding B5 deficiency all over the brain? Not in any place, not in every place, but in specific locations. Then they did the next step, which was to say, what about Parkinson's disease? Same thing, like B5 deficiency, slightly different parts of the brain. Then the next part was they obviously can't do it in humans for ADD, ADHD, but we now have imaging procedures, that PET scan type procedures where you can actually label certain chemicals, and you can see, are these parts of the brain B5 deficient? Those articles are starting to come out. And then the most pivotal one is the same group that's in New Zealand said, coenzyme A is one of the pivotal parts of the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle, which is really the core of how the mitochondria do their work. If the mitochondria throughout the brain are B5 deficient, then there should be focal abnormalities of the metabolites that citric acid cycle makes that are related to coenzyme A being deficient, with the other enzymes being fine. And they showed that. That means when we have this cascade of events, we have not only D deficiency with all its direct effects, we have lack of these Bs that have myriad of effects. The only one we're going to talk about is B5. But then we also have lack of coenzyme A affecting probably every mitochondria throughout our body, its ability to do its job.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say here is there's two different myths related to the B vitamins that you're busting. One being the storage piece, that we can actually store these. And two being that it's assumed we can get them all from foods. And you're saying that isn't the case, at least in all of them.
Yes. There's another really important piece, which is probiotics are just dead bacteria. They're just freeze-dried bacteria. Okay. I've been using those for 5 years. They didn't do jack for me. They didn't do jack for my patients. And we were trading recipes. Oh, my GI doctor has this other probiotic. Okay. And everybody's making lots of money selling bacteria. It doesn't work. The bacteria goes down there. If you don't give it the growth factors it needs, it's gone in a minute. Okay. But there's a second approach to this, which is called prebiotics. Prebiotics is really what we're talking. That's a big idea. If I know what the requirements are for these 4 phyla that help support these 4 phyla, and I'm giving them that means I feed my bacteria feeds me. That's really the core idea. And in the background, there's another piece that's being set into the prebiotics, which is fermented food. You can think about it as I'm eating rotting food. That's really what you're doing, okay? You're letting the food rot. Now, you happen to have hundreds of generations of humans that have let food rot, and then they figured out how to not let it rot so it kills you. Because if it rots in a certain way, then you get botulism and you die, okay? There are very specific paths that when you go down this fermenting food is healthy for you, you will see that there are instructions on how to do that with milk or how to do it with cabbage. So kimchi is cabbage. And so we're doing this fermentation in very specific ways. Keep in mind that the fermentation I told you about at the very beginning was a yeast bacterial mixture. You put this liquid, you put yeast in it. Yeast provides D2 that bacteria like. And the bacteria that are actually produced by setting it on a warm ledge, it is producing more and more daughter bacteria. So there are a whole bunch of bacteria in there. Those bacteria are secreting things into the liquid. Those things are the same things they would be secreting in our belly if they were living inside us. Okay. What you've created is a D-B mixture in that liquid. And you've also, without knowing it, you're taking in all of these metabolites that turn out to be part of our body. They are supposed to be part of us. So you're doing the fermentation outside the body, and then you're eating that stuff. So one of the questions that should be there in everybody's mind is, you say that only by giving D and B50 can you bring back the microbiome. But B50 is a human creation. It's been around since probably maybe 1960. If there are people that I can read about in history, actual individuals who were put in the Tower of London for 8 years because they were on the wrong side of that king gets killed and their favorite comes in and they get loosed from the Tower of London at age 40 and they look like they've aged 20 years and their hair is white and their teeth have fallen out. All these things that we now know are D deficiency. But that guy lives to be 80 and writes a bunch of articles and serves in the British, as the religion, some really important pivotal. He's got his mind. He lives to be 80. There has to be a way to do it naturally without B50. Okay? It is my belief that this fermented food is duplicating what happens with that B50. I'm also reading a set of books that are talking about detective novels in the 1300s. And this guy is a historian, and every single book, he's talking about how when they walk out of their house, they're walking down streets that are covered with shit. Dog shit, people shit, poop everywhere. The environment is filthy. And he describes the food they're eating that's been sitting on the counter with flies on it for 4 days. It's a meat pie. It's disgusting. But in actual fact, they're eating rotting food. As long as you happen to get it in the right kind of rotting, it actually was something that duplicated this, what's now a purified B50.
Have you been able to, in a person or people, replicate the results from a B50 by using specific fermented foods at this point?
I have not, but I have a couple of clients who, for instance, used nutritional yeast, quote unquote. Okay. And this is really a preparation that where you grow all these things and then you dry it. Okay. So you've got it sitting there in the water and you let the bacteria grow and then you dry it out. And sometimes when I'm going through the history, this person has bad IBS and then they saw a naturopath 3 years ago who gave them D and B100 and they got fixed. And we have to attend to that. They're seeing me now because they're still on B100 3 years later, and all the same things they wanted to get treated are back. Okay, so that's one. But the second one is, instead of using B100, they've used nutritional yeast, a lot of it, on every food, and they like it. And they say, it's funny, but my IBS went away 2 years ago, and it hasn't come back. So then you have to be listening for that. And it's my belief that given the right setting, I don't know how to do it because I haven't done it yet. And because what I'm trying to do is put out a workbook that's dependable for all people. And I really don't have a good sense of which bacteria are living in which one of these fermented foods. But I want to put it out there because there's some aspects to what I say that don't fit with the idea that you want it to be as natural as you can, because it really needs a B50. I'm not sure it really does, but I haven't really gone down that path yet.
All right, I have a couple B12 questions. One being, a lot of times in the vegan world, people that are eating that diet will take a B12 injection regularly. You talked about B12 injections or a supplement orally. Have you found any adverse reactions with somebody taking just B12 in that case or other? Because as we're talking about here, everything in the gut is working in concert. And it's not just an isolated thing. So for somebody to take B12 and then not build up these other B vitamins in their system at the same time, can that be problematic?
You ask very good questions. My first part of the answer is that there are populations in India that have lived for thousands of years following a vegan diet. Okay. The Jains and that religious group have a belief system that means that they don't even want to step on an insect. Okay. That means we have populations that have lived in India forever who have done fine on a vegan diet. Unfortunately, the people doing vegan diets here are usually doing it because they feel like crap and they don't know why. And they're trying to change their diet to feel better, but they do not live outside. So up until the last 100 years, all of the vegans that we're talking about having proven that the vegan diet works for humans lived outdoors. So be vegan, then we know that since B12 comes from meat and you're not eating meat, then you give B12 shots. I have many clients that over time have said, I have this bad outcome when I use a B12 shot. And frequently they say things that are about acetylcholine levels. I get anxious. My belly starts to feel weird. I get pain. I feel agitated. At the beginning, I would go, I just don't know what to make of that. Okay. I mentioned before that there are some people that their microbiome is so shot that they can't really tolerate B50. some of those people can't really even tolerate the B vitamins. And they've tried multivitamins before and have gotten nausea or just feel bad in some non-specific way. That's a really challenging idea, because if we say these 8 chemicals are things that we are pivotal for our ability to go forward as humans. So the story that I've made up is there are some people who are so profoundly depleted in D, and almost always it's in people who've had D levels that were measured at 10, 9, 15, and that was, 10 years ago. So and especially in children, from Canada, I have a client who, when we first tested her, she's 18 and her level was 8. Okay. And she's never menstruated. She's otherwise female, but, so there are things about this that suggest that she's never really slept normally. She had bad depression, etc. Those are all things that are considered to be normal now, but were not normal 60 years ago, let's say. When we try to give her even 10,000 of D, her body just freaks out. So many times, even the starter doses of D that I recommend in my workbook are way too high for those people. And even starting a multivitamin, they don't feel right. When that happens, you have to back way off and start at little tiny doses. What I noticed with my first patient group that did not usually have Ds that they were that profoundly low was some people, you cannot rush it. If they don't feel good with a multivitamin that has tiny little doses of Bs, then you just stay with D and you use the level of D, the dose of D that the body will accept. And you're just patient and you keep letting it go up and up and up. And about 3 months later, you try a multivitamin again, and mysteriously, their body doesn't freak out. My hypothesis is that this body has existed, let's say for this gal in where she was, which was Toronto, since her birth. She has existed with 1/10 of each one of these pivotal things that her body needs. So her nervous system is using workaround pathways that are using minuscule amounts. So she's been able to live and look like a normal human. She's not, but then I give her 100 times what her body has been used to seeing. That also claims that the Bs in the food are not they might be in the food, but her ability to actually absorb those Bs is not normal because her microbiome has been bad all along. So in a lot of people who have these reactions, they convert to being a normal human. It's not just that they convert their microbiome. Their nervous system actually has to catch up and change what it's using. They get a better outcome, and it's only by saying, every other animal is using whatever dose their microbiome is making. You may not know what that is, but in humans, my experience has been it's around B50 because I had really good luck with that by accident. I don't know who put that on the shelf, but it turns out to be about right. That person will convert to being needing B50 eventually, but but there's a place that D is doing things in the chemical pathways that makes that happen. So if you're just patient, that person will get to be wanting B50, and then they'll go through the same pathways as everybody else, where then you have to wait until they can tolerate B50. And what you've done is you actually are supplying 2 separate things. With the amount of D and Bs you're giving, you're supplying that person's nervous system. And you have to listen to what their nervous system says. If you give more than they want, it's a very unpleasant experience and it doesn't help. Then slowly over time, their nervous system will tell you anxiety, agitation, sleep, belly complaints that are about the nervous system of the belly. They will tell you when they're ready for those Bs to go up. Okay. I think what I did originally, so back to your question about B12, what I did originally was I produced these specific deficiency states that actually we've seen a lot more of since COVID because I gave B12 and D. And since everybody got into testing the vitamins with COVID and they started to give D and we can test B12 and the B12 blood level is helpful. None of the B levels in my experience are the least bit helpful. The blood levels are worthless. We can talk about that more if you want. But I think what's happened since COVID is COVID toe is something that I actually produced in my patients before COVID. I didn't know what it was, but a purple, painful, burning toe turns out to be an autonomic dysfunction happening in that toe focally, that if you get the B5 right, it goes away in like 12 hours. And it'll come right back. If you stop the B12 in 3 days, it comes right back again. Very weird stuff that as a clinician, I had never seen anything like that happen. Many of the things that people are describing as long COVID are really B5 deficiency. They are sleeplessness, terrible pain, inability to think, memory disorders. We've induced that, not because of the COVID. The virus hasn't changed them. What's happened is we gave D during COVID. Their D level went up. And the reason why I have a website is because this event, I made my patients worse at 2 years. That's really important. And when COVID came, I thought, this is terrible, because every single person who goes to their doctor is going to be given a label, long COVID, COVID toe. There's no treatment for that, yet it is curable.
All right, last question about B12 before we move on. The way I understand it, B50 and other B complex supplements have the B12 as a piece of that. So you're taking that orally. You talked about before the fact that, and I believe this is when people got their vitamin D up, they could absorb the B12 orally better. And then you also talked about somebody getting an injection and then 2 days later being deficient in B12. And the whole reason it was a monthly thing was because of healthcare payments. So what I'm getting at here is early on, when somebody is just starting to rebuild, can their system handle and absorb and utilize B12 orally? And then later on,
it is my impression that most of the problems that we see are not about absorption. So that word has been used, the reason why your B12 level doesn't go up is because you can't absorb it. And that fantasy has been taught in medicine, because most of the time we see these things in ulcerative colitis or in a setting where we have been told the GI tract itself, okay, the actual tube that's my body is not acting correctly, okay? That was medicine's view. Therefore, absorption is the key. If you put your mind in a different state and you say, really, absorption is about, do I have the right microbiome growing inside me? Because you really do have to have the bacteria there, not only to make these 8 chemicals, but they also make other metabolites that play a role in being able to absorb them. So it has been my experience that you don't really have to get that careful about B12. You can start with oral B12 at the beginning. I still have some patients who do oral B12 and don't feel too good on 1,000 and go to 500 micrograms. I still have patients who find that they don't think that the oral is as helpful for them as the injections. And some of them do injections every day, and some of them do injections once a week. My comment to those people is I want them to do whatever feels right for them. But if I'm focusing on what I think is the most important, which is I want my brain to have every single little tiny piece that it needs every single night to sleep, because the sleep is really repair over months or years. And if every 5 days I have what it needs, but my experience has been that in some people, the level goes down to 200 again in 2 days, you're really not supplying every single little tiny thing it needs every single day. So it's really, once we get into the nuances of B12, I really want to leave it up to that person and what their experience is. I never expected anybody to ever have a side effect from B12, either injection or orally. And it's very rare. But when the person tells me things that I would expect for B5 being too high, and they tell me that when they take their B12, I think, I don't know how they know to make that up. So I listen to what they say and go, in some people, maybe that's too big a dose of B12. You know, there's a whole other piece to this, which is extremely complex, which we haven't talked about, which are single nucleotide polymorphisms called SNPs. And those are playing a role in our folate, choline, and B12 metabolism that are all about methylation of various things, the methylation pathway. And I just stumbled into a literature that shows that if you become choline deficient, and we'll talk about that in a minute, you can become B12 deficient as a secondary case because your choline is not supplying what the body needs to make methylation happen. Therefore, your use of this other pathway, which uses B12, is overused. And that some of the people that have those SNPs are actually B12 deficient, not because of the things we talked about, but because they've actually become choline deficient. And what I'm aware, and the reason why I'm interested in this is if I'm giving a whole bunch of supplements, I'm biohacking, but I don't know the whole picture, bad things happen and I don't have an explanation. Okay. Just recently, in myself, in my business coach, and 2 or 3 other people who've done RightSleep for 10 years, we've had things like generalized joint pain, arthritis, problems with sleep again, muscle pain, aching muscles that don't work right, problems with the gait. I'm describing what's happened to me recently. And it turns out that choline deficiency does all of those things. So I'm proposing in the RightSleep workbook, I'm waiting until I get better so that and that other people have tried this before I'm putting it in the workbook. But there's a level of complexity here, which is if I'm giving, so the equation that we might actually pull up and look at to make acetylcholine, if I'm saying we're all acetylcholine deficient, and I'm giving back the enzyme, the final enzyme that makes that chemical, which is D related, and the 2 pieces that are necessary to work with that enzyme are choline and coenzyme A. We just spent a couple of hours talking about coenzyme A. But if I'm not matching the choline amount to that coenzyme A, I could actually artificially make that person choline deficient over a long span of time. And I think that's what's happening here. Choline is said to come from eggs and from diet. And in the general sense, most of the time people write about it as choline doesn't become deficient because it's in the food. But if you look into a different literature, there's a big literature about choline deficiency presenting in pregnant women because they're supplying choline along with all the other things to their fetus. And there's a big literature about how this SNP population has a different response and they become B12 deficient and that sort of thing. So there's a level of complexity in the background that also suggests if you're biohacking, there are pieces of this that where you may show up with something 3 or 4 years later, which is why I'm still on the internet and I'm still saying this is a work in process. Okay. I don't know if I answered your question there, but.
Well, we've covered a lot. I forget where we came from there, but this is great. I want to make sure before we leave the choline piece, given what you said there, potentially being a limiting factor in this equation, which we'll put up on the screen in the final video, is there anything we can do supplement-wise or food-wise, you mentioned a food or two there, to be preventative if we're somebody who is, I think you mentioned during pregnancy, or if somebody has one of these SNPs, I would assume for the average person, there probably wouldn't be, and you can clarify, harm in making sure we're getting enough choline. But how do we address the equation from the choline piece?
I still want to give the warning that I'm not completely clear on this. This is literature I just started to read, and it's very complex. I personally love biochemistry, so this is the place that I love. Also, I have friends and relatives who have become B12 deficient. They were not B12 deficient at the beginning of the RightSleep program. And this is my husband. 10 years into it, they are B12 deficient. Where's the explanation for that within what we've talked about? That doesn't make any sense. What I told you was you can actually fix it by taking D. So that made me wonder whether or not I and my husband have actually worked on this. This is the longest follow-up I've had because I left my practice. 10 years into it, is it possible that I'm not eating enough eggs, or enough eggs is a state assuming that we never became deficient, okay? And keep in mind, as I'm biohacking, I may be causing a deficiency to develop. So one of the important things is in those B50 bottles, there's almost always choline, inositol, and paddle. And I didn't know why. But usually there's between 50 and 100 milligrams of choline. So they've matched choline to the amount of B5. That's interesting because there are probably articles that explain why they did that in the first place. Okay. And maybe they're looking at the equation. But when you stop the B50, then there's an assumption that you're eating a lot of eggs and you're not going to become choline deficient. What I'm doing right now is I'm adding choline in people who've had muscle complaints. My muscles don't feel right. I work out and they're weaker. They hurt. That is not typical. You haven't heard me talk about muscle pain as part of the symptoms so far. But in people with muscle pain already, and in anybody who has a story, like remember the gals with them burning in their hands and feet? When the person comes in to the program with these really outliers, like burning in the hands and feet, a gait disorder, muscle pain, where I think I'm going to have to add much bigger B5 doses, then I'll match the amount of choline to the B5 dose. Because I have some people who are on, once they're supposed to stop the B50, as soon as they do that, everything falls apart. Or we really, to make at the beginning of the RightSleep program, they have to go up into 2 B100s and 300 milligrams of B5 to make their weird neurologic symptoms go away. We're using the neurologic symptoms as a way of dialing up and down so the sleep gets better, to get a sense for what's the dose that they need. Because what they've done, I have one client right now who has been on D for 10 years. And in the last 3 years, he's developed these other horrible things that to me are B5 deficiency by itself. It turns out he was supplementing all 7 Bs, but not B5. That was the only one he wasn't. He was doing each one individually. And he's forced himself into actually pulmonary hypertension and atherosclerosis of the pulmonary arteries, things that I've never thought of having anything to do with it, by not giving that 8th thing. In that guy, if I want to give really high doses of B5, I want to match the amount of choline with it. I'm just beginning this, so I really am not good at which type of choline. There are many types, so I'm just starting to read about that. But that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Earlier on, we talked about the fact that somebody, and I want you to clarify if this was, it sounded like a group of people earlier on, when they started taking D, could go for a couple of years before they started to have symptoms and then needed to bring the B vitamins in. Was that one, or was that a whole group of people early on?
Oh, no, that was about probably a total of 1,000 people.
So a lot of people. Okay.
A lot of people.
Is the assumption we were making at that point, say it was 2 years, that things worked with just vitamin D, that they had enough store of the B5 to make the equation work?
That was my assumption. Now, it's my thought that had I known all of this at the beginning, I would have recognized that there were certain people coming in. Nobody came in with burning in their hands and feet over that 2 years, because that is very unusual. And I don't have anybody else to send it to. I'm the neurologist with the neuropathy experience, okay? And I know that I use B12, so I know nobody came in with that. And it may be that that is a really profound B5 deficiency, or that what we're looking at there is, remember the articles about D inducing a change in the microbiome and certain species coming back, the anti-inflammatory species coming back, has now been published since 2020. So D has an effect, but it has a partial effect. And it may be that there is one particular species where if you just give D, but you don't give what it needs, it is the one that becomes profoundly low. We actually have a huge literature about this now, where every week there are articles about this particular species needs this particular B vitamin to make this, okay? And oddly enough, B12 is an extremely complex molecule that has a boron in the middle of it, pretty much like hemoglobin that has an iron in the middle of it. It's so complex chemically that they don't use inorganic chemistry methods to make it. They use bacteria. They use this particular species that pumps out B12, and they grow the bacteria, and they collect the liquid on the outside, And that's what they put in a pill. So that means there will be, within the next 10 years, really clear evidence. For instance, we know that there's certain lactobacillus that need B5. So it's not that we're the only ones using the B5 that we take as B50. Lactobacillus uses B5 and it competes with us to take up this B5. We also know that certain lactobacillus species make very specific metabolites that allow us to absorb iron. So we talked about that a little bit before. That means we are going to get the information about which of these bacteria do these certain things. And I suspect that when we gave D by itself for 2 years, we were doing okay. And some of the Bs are going to come from the food, without a question. We were doing okay, except we just lost this one particular thing. And it's my suspicion that all these things that have been renamed as COVID related are basically looking at the same experiment where everybody started taking D. And then 2 years later, they have specific things. They don't have a purple horn growing out of their forehead. We don't think of it that way. But medicine is really designed to treat things and name things that walk in the door. That means there's a very specific list of things that have been attached to COVID. They turn out to be very, very parallel to what I saw happening in my patients at the 2-year mark.
All right, we're going to continue the story there from the 2-year mark. You start giving people the B complex, their symptoms diminish, but then a few months later they come back. And the reason I want to keep coming back to this is just to understand the physiology for people, even though likely, and I want to get to what the current protocol looks like, you're not putting people through that period of time. I'm assuming the B complex comes in at the beginning now. But are we assuming then, given what we said earlier on today, that during that period of time when we go for a few months with the B complex and then symptoms come back, that's because the gut at that time is revved up, creating their own B vitamins, and then that plus the supplement becomes too much for the body, and then things start to happen in a negative way and go awry?
That's a beautiful summary. Now, keep in mind that all of this is hypothetical. But at the time, everybody who was seeing me as a neurologist for all their separate things, who had also had a sleep study, is, if they're willing, doing this with me. Okay. And I'm doing the same thing because I'm waking up all the time and I'm perimenopausal, and everybody would say that's why, but I'm taking supplement of estrogen, progesterone, and my sleep is so crappy and I still have restless legs. So I have a sleep disorder also, and I'm doing the same thing. And I'm going to take you through this piece of it, telling you what happened to me. So as I told you, my patients are coming back with this burning in their hands and feet, generalized joint pain. They've just been to the rheumatologist. They've been told they have lupus. And I'm like, oh my God, what if I caused that? What if I caused this autoimmune state? That would be horrifying. And why do I have this butt pain? And I haven't hurt myself. And this all is very confusing. So I'm taking this B50 with my patients. And as I told you, I told them, if your symptoms come back, I want you to stop the B50. And that's how I learned that it happens in 3 months, and pretty consistently. The patient may not come back in 3 months, but we go back and we say, okay, what happened? You're just as sick as you were when you left me 6 months ago. What happened 3 months ago? So I'm taking the B50 for 3 months, and all my symptoms are much, much better. And then in the 4th month, I begin to be really stiff in the morning, and then my butt starts to hurt again. And one of my patients says to me, you gave me B100 because I was using B100 at the time. And how I learned that B100 was too much for the most people who walk in the door was, she says, you gave me B100. As soon as I started taking that, I ache all over. When I wake up, I feel old in the morning. I was like, that's what I felt like. That's what I feel like now. And she said, well, I broke it in half and I'm taking B50 and I feel great. And I went, oh, I must be on too much. And I stopped my B100, and that aching in the morning goes completely away and the butt pain goes away. Now, at the time, I am not someone who likes vitamins, so I'm not taking a multivitamin. I'm not taking anything else. I'm keeping my eye on my D level. It's 65. I'm feeling great. I'm running up hills now. I feel fantastic for about 6 months. And in the meantime, I'm trying this. Now I'm doing B50 because in the person who walks in the door with, first I had this pregnancy, and then I couldn't sleep, and then I had painful feet, and then I had my second pregnancy, and then I got IBS, and then I have a headache every day, and then I have fibromyalgia, and then I've been told I have adrenal fatigue. That person is a mess. They have actually been profoundly deficient before I ever touched them with D, based on all these symptoms. And that person does great with B100. But if it's a gal who walks in and said, I had one pregnancy, I sleep fine, or I think I do, and I have daily headache, I learned B100 is too much for her. So now we start at B50, and we start D and B50 and a multivitamin. At the time, I really couldn't see any reason for taking a multivitamin. So 6 months go by and my butt starts to hurt again. And my hypothesis was our biology came second to this pile of poop bacteria that makes specific amounts of Bs. So why should we ever take Bs again? Why should we need a supplement? But my butt is hurting and my sleep is getting bad again. And I reach into the medicine cabinet. My husband has this multivitamin that has 5 milligrams of B5. Keep in mind, I'm afraid of it now because it made me achy. And I'm like, that stuff is dangerous. I take that for 3 months. Nothing happens. My butt still hurts at the end of the day. I can't sit down. And then one day I take 2 of them, 10 milligrams of B5. Boom, my butt pain's gone. Just like that. And it's not that the butt pain is important. It's this concept that if my butt pain is meaning that my brain is asking for this extra tool, I want whatever I can to make it sleep better. Okay. I can't see inside my sleep. So it's at that point that I think, maybe sleeping better, because I was been sleeping better for 6 months. Man, I felt great. My energy level is good. Maybe sleeping better. And this is another really new concept. Sleeping better means I've actually, every single night, I've done the nightly maintenance list. And our brain has a list of everything it does. And it probably does some things once a week, some things once a month, but other things every single night. What if I've slept well enough that the brain gets to the point where it says, I've completed everything on my nightly list, but I got some leftovers. Like, let's check the roof and let's make sure the foundation needs some work. Some things that really take a lot of extra building blocks. If you would give me, so it's sending me a message that I need more of these building blocks, which to me was mysterious. But I'm making the assumption that it took 6 months to show up with better sleep, that those 2 requirements. And then I say to myself, okay, I don't want my patients to go through this. Therefore, I'm going to say, we just reconstituted the microbiome. That may mean that we're all of us deficient, not only in Bs, but in all the minerals, all these cofactors that the microbiome is supposed to make. Maybe everything that's in the multivitamin needs to be slightly supplemented during a year and a half to make sure that the brain has enough. So we are giving extra, but we're also asking the brain to do extra work because we got the D right and we've got the D in perfect sleep range. Okay. So I start to demand that the patient take a multivitamin with 10 milligrams of B5. At the time, that was the daily recommended dose of B5. So it was easy. So we just make sure that the Bs are tiny little doses, not big doses. We have all the minerals and we give that as part of the routine. And the RightSleep program includes a multivitamin with specific 10 milligrams of B5 because I considered myself to be the least sick of all of my patients. Okay. They're coming in to be a neurologist. So their sleep has been bad enough that they started to have epilepsy or headaches or something else. And that the least amount that I'm going to need to give them to prevent this additional that's later. So I'm hoping that they won't have to do more. Well, I do that for about 6 months. And I took the additional in a multivitamin for 6 months, but then my restless legs got worse again. So I had to come off of that multivitamin. And ever since then, for the last 8 years or so, even 2.5 milligrams of B5, I am aggressive, angry, impatient, my worst self that had shown up in the past. Okay. In the meantime, the other thing I was thinking was, if I'm the least sick and I needed 10 milligrams of B5, is it possible that someone who has lupus, who's had all those other things I described, and that gal who had 2 pregnancies and acquired all these things over time, is it possible that those people are going to need more B5 when we have better sleep and the brain gets to the point of saying, I've done nightly maintenance for 3 months, 4 months, and now I need more of these things. And in actual fact, all of my clients have to stop the B50 at 3 months. But not everybody is completely happy on 10 milligrams of B5 in months 4, 5, and 6. Some people who have been sicker longer need 15 milligrams or 20 milligrams of B5. They need slightly more Bs. But there is a span of time then, month 4, 5, and 6, and maybe 7, maybe 8 in each person, where their brain doesn't want as much as they did in B50. And if you try to go back to B50, which many of my patients did, because in month 5, they start, actually month 6. So then it turns out that the way the workbook is written, you stop the B50 at 3 months, and then at month 6, 3 months after you stop the B50, if you have been sleeping better, and only if you've been sleeping better, your brain will send you signals that it wants more Bs. It might want more minerals too. Then we have to adjust that. We have to go up. All the things that you had before come rushing back. So you're only better. And it's really the most difficult part of this whole concept is I got better and then I'm worse again. I haven't changed anything in the vitamins. This whole idea that there's a minimum daily recommended dose is utterly made up. Each person has a different amount of these things that it needs, depending on where the D level is, what their history has been. So you have to listen to what your body says. And there's a third part of the workbook where I tell you to slowly increase by 5 milligram increments until you get to a place where you're much better, which whatever you're following for you, anxiety, burning, pain in your back, there are many different symptoms. That's very complicated. And that's why there's a workbook, because there's something that happens on a timeline and you lose track of where you are on that timeline very rapidly. So the second piece of this workbook is a journaling, and now I'm using a journaling app on the phone for most people. I want you to be aware of where you are on this timeline because these predictable things are happening. Then what happens is you are on extra amount, this multivitamin, let's say, for a fixed period of time. And for most people, it's 6 months to a year. Someone who's been really sick, it can be a year and a half. And then all the symptoms start to come back again. And that's the sign that they need to start tapering off. And the brain is very picky. Again, when they taper off, they can't just stop it, which is really weird. They can't just stop it because then everything falls apart. It's just as bad at 0 as it is at 50 milligrams, let's say. Some of the people go back to B50. Some of them have to go to 300, 800, 2 grams of B5. So, and the person who needs 2 grams or 3 grams of B5 is someone who's never slept since she was a little girl, very dark skin, had this, that, and the other thing, had 1 pregnancy, everything fell apart. At age 52, she goes into the hospital with urinary sepsis and then has lupus cerebritis and is in a coma for a month, okay? Sick as can be. And really, those people don't usually survive. She somehow survives. So the clinical history is what reflects the doses or the profundity of the B5 deficiency. The blood level is unfortunately worthless.
All right. Given what you just said and how different this is going to look depending on the person and their health history and what their current part of the health healing timeline they're on, let's go really high level though and talk about where the protocol has evolved to today. Somebody new working with you, and we're not going to get into dosages because, again, it's going to differ depending on the person. So basically, as we're starting to wrap up here, in a really general sense, what is the current protocol?
Okay, the first thing to know is if I say go to my website, it's too overwhelming, okay? Really what I say is go to Jesse's podcast or a webinar, because it's important to hear the background and just sit and listen to it, let it wash over you, and maybe listen to it 2 or 3 times so that you get a sense for the belief system, because it's really a belief system. If the belief system, what you get while you're listening is, that happened to me, and that's why this happened, then this is the right program for you. If you listen to it and you go, this is way too complicated, I don't want to go down that path, then you just don't do it, okay? Then, once you've done that, then you go to the website and you read more things. There are all sorts of free things that are about, should I use this if I have lupus? Should I use this with my kids? Should I use this with blah, blah, blah? And how do I go about that? And then the second question is, how? How do I actually do it? What's a practical thing that I do? And that's what the RightSleep workbook is. And you pay for that, you download it. And when you do that, you have also access to 2 years of question and answer segments once a month. So you have all those videos you can look at. Then every question you can come up with has already been answered in the FAQs, but most people don't want to read the FAQs. And the pertinence of that question only happens when it happens to you. And then you want to go back. And so all those Q&As are actually, they have text that tells you what's covered and where to go for that. Okay. So now we have not only that, we have specific videos that are part of your purchase that are for kids, how to do this in children and why it's different when that's a toddler or you're nursing your baby or they're 18 or 15. Plus we have a private Facebook group with other people who've been on this program, because it's complicated and you're not going to hear these same things anywhere else. All right. The actual details of what you do when are in the workbook, and they tell you how to get good D levels done. So using this Alta that we mentioned before. So that workbook is your personal assistant who takes you through this whole pathway, and it tells you exactly what to do for a year and a half. Now, I also do private coaching. So you can make a single appointment with me. That's called Let Me Get to Know You. That's a half an hour. And this is what I personally have wrong with me. Do you think RightSleep is the right path? And then we talk together about your personal experience and things like, did you use nutritional yeast in the past, and things that would modify how you would go into it. I also have what's called a strategy session. So let's say you're following in the workbook. I want this to be available to everyone, no matter what their financial status is. Okay. And that means, my coaching is $300 a month. That's a chunk of change. Not everybody can afford that. So there are single appointments that you can make to say, I've been doing this for 5 months. This happened, this happened, this happened. Now I hit this wall. What should I do? So you can talk to me about it. And I also have coaching programs that you can start when you begin. You say, this is too complicated for me. I want to meet with you. And we meet together every 6 weeks, and that's for a full year. And I ask you to commit to a full year, because it's not just, it won't take you a year to get better. You'll be able to feel better within a month or two, but then you'll feel worse again. That's when you learn that these things that we've told you are benign and you don't really need them, or you can never hurt yourself with them. That's not true. You need to change those vitamin doses and then see that you get better. So you attach your physical symptoms to these little things that we're using. So that's also an option. I don't usually give out the doses in particular because of all the things we just talked about. This is relatively complex. I also have lectures that I'm going to start putting on my YouTube channel. So I have a YouTube channel that has little tiny 5-minute pieces, one little piece that says, what do you think about snoring? What do you think about taking a nap? What do you think? So my view of what's right and wrong with sleep is very, very different than most of the sleep experts, because I'm going on things that I've seen happen in my clients when surprisingly I fixed their sleep. We've been told that you're either an early riser or you're a night owl, and it's genetically that way. That is not true. I've seen people go I used to sleep from 4 a.m. to noon, and I was able to switch that back to 10 to 6. So I have a lot of ideas that are based on, I would never have thought those things until somebody comes in and they're different. I also have lectures that I'm going to be putting up on that are also free. So there's a lot of free information like what you're putting out. that's meant to hit the level of curiosity to actually follow a path that's quite long, pretty complicated, but definitely worth it.
All right. Given all that, though, can you give us the high level handful of supplements people will use?
Sure.
Not dosages, but you've said a lot here over the course of, 3+ hours. We know vitamin D is a piece, B vitamins, you mentioned multivitamin, minerals. Just give us that top level view of what's included.
What you start with in the RightSleep program is you do your D level and you do it in the specific way that we talked about. That's not that easy to do in Canada. You do a B12 level. Those are the two things that you do. You decide whether or not you're going to supplement with B12 based on that B12 level. If it's below this, you don't take it. You take B12. If it's above this, you don't. And then you start with a combination of a specific multivitamin, not a brand, but specific doses. D at doses that are determined based on what your level is. You're given instructions to do your D level every month for the first 3 months and a specific multivitamin. And that's it. That's all you start with. And then you're instructed to journal. The most important part is you have to decide at the beginning of your journey, what are the symptoms that are related to this? And it turns out every symptom you have is related to this. Normal humans don't go to the doctor because there's nothing wrong with them. They don't have any complaints. So you write them all down. So that piece is a really important part of doing the program because nobody else tells you that your depression is related to your sleep and your B5. And nobody else tells you that your generalized arthritis that we've said was lupus is related to, in this odd way, to your acetylcholine level because of this. So you have to reestablish your point of view of what your list of medical problems are. And let me just add a list here because we haven't really gotten into what does acetylcholine deficiency produce, okay? Is that okay?
Yeah, I actually wanted to end on acetylcholine. So basically for people that have tuned in to this point, they probably understand and know this, but I'll just, cue you up here. You have B5, you have vitamin D, and those together produce the acetylcholine. And then you can talk about what that does and what happens when we don't have enough.
And let me say that I've learned all of this because my patients have certain things that go away. And I go, wait, that's not supposed to go away. So the autonomic nervous system, and we talked about this in the first section, the autonomic nervous system is constantly sensing, is the sympathetic or the parasympathetic going to be dominant? And if you lose acetylcholine, you have sympathetic dominance all the time. Well, the first thing that happens is your blood pressure goes up. So ever since I've been in medicine, we've been told that hypertension is a disease. It's not a disease. Hypertension, it means that your blood pressure is too high. That means if a 22-year-old has blood pressure that's too high all the time, they have acetylcholine deficiency. That's a really different way of looking at it. And because we had no drugs that duplicate it, then we made up millions of antihypertensives, okay? So blood pressure that's elevated, heart rate that's elevated, anxiety. I had so many young, healthy females who I was treating with all of this for their headaches who would tell me, last week, I don't know if this has anything to do with what you're doing for me, but last week, and oh, by the way, their heart rate's 110 and they're exercising regularly. They're normal weight. They shouldn't have a resting heart rate of 110. So last week I'm taking my kids to school and I had this panic attack. I'm behind the wheel and I start shaking and nobody rear-ended me. And I drop them off and I go to the emergency room and they say, you had a panic attack. And they give them Xanax. That means that their sympathetic side is so high that it duplicated the same physical parameters you would have if she'd been rear-ended, but there was no outside stimulus. She is acetylcholine deficient. It turns out all autoimmunity, the immune system was very carefully designed to never attack itself. It is so common to have autoimmunity, allergy, asthma, various psoriasis, eczema, these things that are really autoimmune disease, those are all related to acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is not only being used in the autonomic nervous system, it is also has what's called the acetylcholine anti-inflammatory pathway, which means it is a separate but integrated Really, it's acetylcholine acting as a hormone. It's being released by T cells into your whole body. So all the autoimmune diseases, all of the mood disorders that are not anxiety are related to, is your serotonin or your dopamine or your acetylcholine matched correctly? So that each phase of sleep, for instance, is about 5 different neurotransmitters, or maybe 25, that are all at the right level. Kind of like picturing it like a symphony. All of the instruments are playing, but they're playing different things as we move through the 3 movements. Similarly, in your basic operation during the day, humans were not made to stay in their house and be depressed and want to commit suicide. Like, that is really abnormal. And it's not your fault. It is not something you are making up in your head. It is something that's wrong with the neurotransmitter ratios. All of the things that we don't have good explanations for, like atherosclerotic disease of the carotid, of the heart, of the lung, pulmonary hypertension, aneurysms, things that are about repair of our soft tissues every night, are all related to D being a builder of our tissues and the inflammatory system being where it's supposed to be, which is not inhibiting that growth and repair. So in actual fact, most of the chronic illness that we have over the last 40 years, especially the ones that you see increasing in incidence, are related in some way in the background to D, microbiome, and interestingly, fatty liver, which isn't interesting to anybody because they don't care. The doctor says you have fatty liver. And I go, turns out non-alcoholic fatty liver was first reported in the 1980s. All of the things like ADD, things that were not described before, IBS, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, they're all things that started being reported in the 1980s. It turns out that fatty liver can be choline deficiency. So, and it's probably not choline deficiency by itself. Okay. So most of the chronic illness, and again, because in the last 40 years, we've changed our point of view so that when the baby is born, you assign a doctor because we all assume they're going to have a bunch of things wrong with them. Well, that's not the way it was 100 years ago. There are populations that I know growing up who never went to a doctor until they were 75. There weren't any doctors. And if they hurt themselves, they had to drive, 200 miles to get their legs set. But they weren't on medications during their life. That means we find the whole idea of normal humans don't need a doctor to be quite foreign. And in actual fact, to stay within what I think is the right way to look at it, my website says we see our doctor once a year because we heal every night. Because the reason why we're talking about these chronic illnesses is because we no longer die of polio. We don't die of scarlet fever. We don't die of diphtheria. We have gained mastery, incredible mastery over the infectious diseases. COVID is not what killed people. They died of cytokine storm. They died of their own immune system attacking them. That means you got to see what it was like to apply a viral infection to a global population that had an abnormal immune system. That's not the way we're looking at it, most of us, but that's really what happened. That means, theoretically, not only can we live better by doing this from the beginning with your child, so they never become D deficient, they never go through this process. The final message in the background is we have to fight against what dermatology has done for the last 40 years, which is to tell us being outdoors, being in the sun is wrong. I am doing this filming outdoors today for a reason, because there are things that are happening to our biology when we are outside, even if we aren't in direct sunlight, that were supposed to happen that kept us healthy. This is also not to minimize exercise, diet, spirituality, connectiveness to other humans. Those are all extremely important. So there's a little tiny wedge of D and the microbiome that the medicine really screwed up on. And we're still fighting against dogma of getting out into the sun. Sunscreen is not a bad thing. It just needs to be used within appropriate context. So that's my summary. And I think it's still, as we talked earlier about choline, it's still learning things.
All right. Well, that's a great way to wrap up. We're going to link up your YouTube channel, your RightSleep program, website, social media, everything in the show notes. This was a beautiful, detailed, long-form conversation. I really appreciate it. I know you've summarized everything beautifully there, but any final thoughts you want to add before we part ways?
The final thing I would say is repairing something that's been 20 years in the making. It's very difficult for all of us to be patient. And we have put forth this idea that doctors have a pill that's going to make you feel better. The people who come to my site and go, this makes perfect sense to me, are usually people who've seen a lot of doctors, they haven't gotten an answer, or they've tried a bunch of things that haven't worked. So in a lot of ways, I really want to send the message that it doesn't mean that your doctor is wrong. It means these are brand new ideas, and you should still use your medical system to its best end. But if you don't get the success you want, then this is something else you can do within the same context as your medical treatment. But it does take a while, and you really do have to think of it in terms of, I'm using my own poorly functioning sleep switches to fix my own sleep. That means I have to be very patient, and I have to try things because they actually need a lot of really important building blocks that I may not even know about yet.
All right. Well, I appreciate you. I appreciate all the information you share. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks for asking me to share this. You asked incredibly good questions. You really have a much better understanding of this process than most people when I give this set of ideas.
Well, thank you. Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
So the shorthand for melatonin that you read all the time is that it's a sleep hormone, and it most emphatically is not. But what does caffeine do? Well, it blocks adenosine receptors within the brain.